Okay. Again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual work group meeting today, sponsored by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. My name is Craig During, a manager in the Mobile Source Control Division at CARB, and I will be joined shortly by my colleagues Tony Brazil, branch chief in our Mobile Source Control Division, and Paul Arnesia, our lead engineer. Today's meeting is part of our Advanced Clean Fleets regulatory efforts of achieving a zero-emission truck and bus California fleet by 2045 everywhere feasible, and significantly earlier for certain market segments such as last mile delivery and drayage applications. We will be dividing today's meeting into two workgroup sessions. The first session will include a focused discussion on the cost analysis and methodology for the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, including key assumptions and data sources for a wide range of trucks and buses. The second workgroup session will include a focused discussion on drayage applications, including how to transition to zero emissions, baseline population and emissions, demonstration projects, and funding opportunities. The first workgroup session on cost will begin shortly and is expected to end somewhere around noon, at which point we will take a break for lunch. The drayage workgroup session will begin at 1 p.m. this afternoon and is expected to end by 4 p.m. today. You are welcome to attend both sessions or simply attend the workgroup session of your choice. The link you use to access this GoToWebinar meeting will be valid for both sessions. Copies of both workgroup presentations and a draft copy of the cost data and methodology discussion document are available on our Advanced Clean Fleets website and can be accessed by clicking the meetings and events link. I would also like to mention that we did post a link in our chat, in the chat feature. So by clicking on that link, you should get direct access to the materials for this meeting. I would also like to mention that today's meeting is being recorded, and a copy of this recording will be made available on our website within the next day or so. The purpose of these two workgroup sessions is to allow for an open and detailed discussion with all interested parties on the two subject topics I just described, and to solicit your feedback for consideration in our regulatory efforts. Therefore, we have designated specific times during each presentation when we will pause for comments and questions. During this time, we prefer that you submit your questions in writing using the question feature on your dashboard. However, you can also use the raise hand feature to indicate you would like to make a comment or ask a question verbally. When called upon, we will ask you to unmute your mic and state your comment or question. As a reminder, please include your name and affiliation when submitting your questions in writing or before asking it verbally. Our intention is to allow for full and open communication throughout today's meeting. However, due to the expected large number of participants, we may need to make adjustments as we review and respond to your comments and questions. This means we may not get to every single question, but our team will do our best to respond to as many relevant questions as possible. Speaking of our team, I would like to recognize those individuals working behind the scenes who will provide technical support and assist in responding to your questions throughout the workgroup sessions. They are Chris Franceschi, Winta Yen, Callie Bracewell, Olivia Lane, Harinder Fagura, Chad Navarrete, and Garrett Schnabel. I would also like to recognize our presenters for both workgroup sessions today. For the cost workgroup session, Paul Arnesia will be presenting and leading the discussion. For the drayage workgroup session, Jessica Johnston will be the lead presenter and be joined by Lachey Cobley, Stephanie King, and Andre Freeman. Okay, with that said, let me introduce Paul Arnesia, who will kick off the cost workgroup session and walk us through our first presentation. Paul?
Thanks, Craig. So thanks everyone for joining today. And I'm getting some feedback, so I think someone on our end needs to mute themselves. Okay, so for today, I'll be kind of walking through a couple things. So first, an overview on what we're doing with the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule and the background for what we're trying to accomplish today and through this work group process. Given the overview on the analysis we previously performed for the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and how we plan to build on that for this Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, and then walk through each of the individual cost elements and assumptions we're using for each of the major components of cost. So I do plan, the general plan for this work group is to stop frequently and try to solicit questions on basically what everyone's thoughts are and how it fits in, whether the assumptions we're using are accurate or there's better information available. So we are planning to stop on each topic, and we're hoping that when we do stop, the questions we hear through the raised hand and verbal feature or through the chat function, we'll be trying to find those that are relevant to discussion. And if it's for something later in the meeting, we might hold off until we get to that portion. Okay, so the given overview, as Craig mentioned, the goal of the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule is to achieve a zero-emission fleet by 2045 where feasible, as directed by our board and the governor's recent executive order. And earlier, so this rule is intended to span from 2023 when it begins out to 2045 when we are near full implementation. And we have earlier goals for certain specific segments. For 2035, we're looking at drayage, public fleets, and last mile delivery. And by 2040, refuse, utility fleets, and buses that have not been covered by other regulations. So we are looking at ways we can accelerate this market and trying to focus on areas that will help the overall market and both protect public health. So some of the elements of what we're looking at in the scope of this rule are discussed below. In terms of what we're looking to do for this specific cost work group, in order for the advanced clean fleet rulemaking, we'll be looking at we will need to do an analysis of the total cost of this rule, and we are looking at this from both the individual vehicle perspective, a fleet perspective in terms of what an individual fleet may need to pay to comply with this rule, as well as a statewide perspective. So we are looking at all those things and want to make sure we're using the best available information. We are not discussing what the proposal, the actual regulation, that'll be discussed in the workshops. Today is solely focused on cost in the morning and drayage in the afternoon. We want to hear what the best sources and assumptions are, so we are trying to solicit feedback on that. And we want to figure out what the costs and savings are on a per vehicle basis, so then we can assess this on a multiple vehicle basis in the fleet and then at the statewide level. So in terms of the cost methodology, these are the general guidelines we have in order to comply with all the different requirements that we need to follow in the rulemaking process. So we are comparing this regulation with a baseline scenario that consists of all the regulations that have already been adopted. So the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, the Low NOx regulation, Phase 2 greenhouse gas, and other programs that are already on the books. We are not including any rebates or grants, as those are incentives meant to encourage additional action. So once it is a regulation, we wouldn't be including those. We are not modeling inflation and are going to be using constant dollars, and we're not using discount rates, again, to comply with requirements in the rulemaking process. So the end goal is to estimate the statewide cost, so that's the total cost to all businesses within California. And we are trying to evaluate this on a more detailed basis, so figure out the different types of fleets and what the cost will be for those sectors individually. In addition to that, we want to do a more detailed look at specific fleet examples to see what some case studies may be to better assess how this might apply to a typical business. And lastly, a lot of these elements we have covered in the Advanced Clean Truck Rule that was approved earlier this June. So we are trying to build on the analysis that we initially performed back in 2019, since there will be some similarities, but there are some areas that we can improve upon. And lastly, I'll give a little bit of background on the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the analysis that we did there. So the Advanced Clean Truck Rule is a manufacturer requirement to produce and sell zero-emission vehicles into California as an increasing portion of the manufacturer's annual sales. So the percentage table is displayed on the right. So manufacturers can comply by building zero-emission vehicles, and there's an optional credit available for plug-in hybrids. And there is some flexibility for manufacturers on where they to sell between different classes, with an exception for the tractors. And there are provisions for banking and trading credits. In addition, there's a one-time reporting requirement that is used to help inform staff about the potential for electrification in different sectors. So in that cost analysis, we did evaluate the total cost to the state, and we include all the elements listed on this slide. So essentially most of the elements listed here we'll be trying to cover in this rulemaking as well, and we'll again try to use the most up-to-date information. And lastly, we are planning to add some new elements that we didn't cover in the advanced clean truck rulemaking. They're listed here. Notably, the low NOx omnibus rule was approved this past August and is anticipated to increase the cost on combustion-powered vehicles. So we do plan to reflect that in this rulemaking. There are some other elements that we've received suggestions on, and we want to attempt to include, but we will need some additional information on basically what the best sources are and how they fit into the overall assumptions. So that's kind of the background on this rulemaking process. Have you received any questions? I don't see any hands in chat, so we can begin to move on then. Looks like we have a question from Tim Blubaugh in chat that says, what is staff's current thinking on how the ACF rule will mandate that fleets purchase ZEVs? So this is I guess broadly, we do envision there being requirements on the advanced clean fleet will be requiring fleets to be purchasing ZEVs. So I guess the number will be how many ZEVs and the time frame. That'll be discussed more during the workshop process, which is a little bit outside the scope. Yeah, I guess the rule broadly will require fleets to purchase ZEVs. Beyond that is more of a question for the workshop process, but really trying to nail down here's the cost elements. Anyone else in the car? Tony, go ahead.
This is Tony. So I think Paul covered it. I mean, one of the reasons we're doing the cost analysis is to understand what the potential impacts and where they may lie, given any strategy that we lay out, and that does ultimately inform how we shape the strategy. But I think for all intents and purposes, for today's discussion, for now, let's just assume that we're matching the manufacturer sales requirement roughly. So that would be roughly 300,000 trucks by 2035 would be deployed. How the regulation shapes out remains to be seen. Again, the end goal is to go 100% where the manufacturer sales requirement wouldn't lead you there. And so I think I'll just touch on it now. So part of the discussion will be when you go beyond the manufacturer requirements, especially post 2030, what are the appropriate assumptions and other things to include there when you go beyond the total sales to the 100%, and especially the 100% in certain fleet categories that might be even earlier. So again, all intents and purposes assume that they're going to be equivalent. Obviously, we're an air quality agency. If we can get more emission reductions, we will seek to do that. And we'll just be discussing that early next year.
Okay, and real quickly, I see one more question from Kevin McGuy. So for potential cost elements to add, I see weight payload. You should also include downtime for charging and range limitations. We'll cover this a little bit later, but that is a good point that for the advanced clean truck rule, we did assume an overnight depot charging. For charging range limitations, we will look at how trucks operate and look at the daily mileage. That is one of the key assumptions we have. But we also can look at a couple different scenarios. If vehicles need to fast charge during the day or need to access retail charging, how should we model that, and in what scenarios is it the most appropriate? So those are things we want to consider. So thanks for the feedback. We have a couple questions. So just a quick one, what is the cost to buy an all-electric truck? We'll be covering that a little bit later, and we do have some assumptions laid out in the cost paper, which I'm hoping everyone has open on the side. We have a question from David Yao. I might have missed it, but how are costs determined for small fleets or subleases and independent contractors? who can often only afford used vehicles, yet might not have access to secondary, tertiary markets for such advanced vehicles. So there's a couple different components to this question. Is an important question. So in terms of vehicles for small independent contractors, so for most of the segments, we do envision that larger companies will be purchasing them first, and as they use them, they'll eventually turn them over, and then they can enter the secondary market. That won't take place for a while. So in the immediate term, all the purchases will be new vehicles. We are going to be looking at what assumptions do we need to potentially shift for smaller businesses. For example, previously for financing, we assumed generally lower interest rates, as most of the larger companies can secure low interest rates, but that might not be true for smaller fleets. So that's something we want to hear about, just whether the assumptions we're using are appropriate for small fleets and small businesses, or if we needed to make any changes to represent these.
Yeah, let me just expand on that just a tiny bit. So it is our intent to be able to understand and use the best information to address a number of questions like this. And so, as Paul mentioned, we will be looking at the smaller fleets, even the owner-operator, to understand what those potential limitations are, either in their ability to access capital or what their rate might be, and these other kinds of questions. All of that is part of helping inform decisions. So I see people are asking, how are we doing it? I mean, part of today's meeting is help us determine the best way to do it. So to the extent that we need to look at different kinds of fleet examples, even if you can call them, I'll put them all in the small fleet category. And there's a way to do that, or a data source to break it up in terms of ability to borrow or financial risk associated with their subprime loans or something along those lines. If people do have sources of information to use for that, by all means, let us know. And if you become aware of that even after this meeting, or want to send us a separate email, we're more than happy to receive information after the meeting. So it doesn't necessarily need to be something that you present today for us to consider it. So again, we're looking to share, here's what our thinking is, help us make sure we cover the bases, and help us identify the best information to use for understanding the fleet and the costs in this particular example.
Okay. I think we have one hand raised, so I'll take that, and then we'll move on to the next portion of the presentation. So, okay, sorry about if I mispronounced your last name. Ben Solomane, I've unmuted your mic. If you could unmute yourself and then give your name and organization, and please give your question. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Ben Solomane with R&A Trucking Company. Just regarding the gentleman's comment right now about you wanting feedback on how to deal with this, the feedback that I have for you on this is that you're asking in the matter of the next couple years to not allow any trucks to be registered in going into the ports. I think it was 23 that no diesel trucks can be registered, and that is one of the things that needs to be pushed back by several years, and maybe alter it to say a certain percentage of the fleet needs to be electric, because that's kind of an unfair ask when really there are no electric trucks being mass produced at this point. And I know you guys are trying to follow Gavin Newsom's directive of 2035, but most people that go in and out of the ports, most people that are effective, are not able to get new trucks that quick, and really there's no trucks out there to be had just yet. So that's all I have.
I'm going to pause for a second. Does anybody from the drayage team want to take that one? Okay. Well, this is Tony.
So this is Andre. I was just going to say, we'll be covering that very topic in the drayage discussion this afternoon, but just say thank you for your comments. But that's definitely something we recognize and we'll be talking about during the timeline portion of the drayage portion of the work group meetings.
Okay, I think with that, we can move on to the next portion. And we'll be stopping for questions pretty frequently, so we'll try to address and give opportunity for people to ask them whenever they come up. So just trying to.
Yeah, well, Paul, I guess just before you shift, so Sean Edgar has a comment. There's an NREL report comparing CNG to the battery electric. He can send us the link, but say by all means do. I'm pretty sure we have access to it, but it's helpful just to get the to get the link on that, just to make sure we're talking about the same.
Yeah, and just for everyone, the best email to send all the if you have sources or feedback, if you could send those to it's on the last slide, and zevfleet@arb.ca.gov. That's what we'll be trying to just keep everything coordinated and use that as the general email moving forward. Okay. So moving on. So next I'll be walking through all the different cost elements and assumptions. So again, we are trying to build on what we did for the advanced clean truck rule, but we do want to make sure we're using the most up-to-date information and identify what's the newer sources. So in terms of the different vehicles, we are for the gasoline, diesel, and natural gas vehicles, we are trying to base these on what's available today. So often this is based on manufacturer website, truck resale websites, and other studies that have come out. So all these are, all this information on what we think our general prices right now are listed in the cost paper that we posted. In addition, we are planning to add costs from the other regulations to help model the cost into the future. So that includes the Phase 2 greenhouse gas regulation and the newly approved low NOx omnibus regulation. For the zero-emission vehicles, we want to make sure that what we're modeling represents what we foresee the cost being in the future. So we are determining these by essentially doing a component cost analysis, or this was the methodology we use in the advanced clean truck rule. So this means that we determine what the cost of the glider is, so just a chassis without a powertrain, add in the cost of components such as electric motors, batteries, fuel cell components, and so on. And we do add an additional factor to represent the other costs involved, such as R&D, engineering, and potential profit. So just quickly, since this is probably one of the most, the largest cost components is the cost of a battery. So in the 2019 analysis, based on feedback from some manufacturers, the assumption that we made is that the battery on a medium or heavy duty vehicle will essentially follow the same path as the light duty battery prices, but with a 5-year delay. So what the battery costs were in 2015 for a light duty battery are the costs we're seeing in 2020 for a heavy duty battery. So we have gotten some feedback that this may not be an appropriate assumption for heavy duty, and we do want to see whether this assumption is still appropriate or whether other assumptions make more sense, or whether there's other data sources we should be using. We also, on the other components, these are the sources we used in the 2019 ACT analysis. So for the general EV components and hydrogen tanks, we relied on a study from the International Council on Clean Transportation. And for the hydrogen fuel cells, we relied on the DOE study by Strategic Analysis. And we just want to know whether these sources are still accurate or appropriate, or whether there's newer information available. And to just generally depict what these costs tend to be once you add everything together. So this is what the 2019 ACT analysis showed for the cost of a Class 8 tractor. So the costs are generally fairly high for the alternatively fueled vehicles in 2020, but are projected to decline as the component costs decrease. And the diesel costs are expected to steadily rise. Just to note, we do not include the low NOx analysis because that was not approved when the ACT rule was being developed. So with the approval, the cost of the diesel vehicle should rise at a faster rate throughout the period. And to give another example, the ACT analysis also looked at a Class 2B and 3 passenger van. So again, the cost of the alternatively fueled vehicles are anticipated to decline. One thing we want to highlight is that based on this analysis, the incremental cost in 2022 would be roughly $20,000 for a battery electric vehicle, What we're seeing today is that Ford announced that their 2022 electric transit van will have a $12,000 incremental cost. So it does appear that this assumption might be too conservative, since we're already seeing manufacturers announce prices far below what we projected. So just kind of illustrating why we might want to update our assumptions for this and other categories. And I'll just cover this last point and then we'll open it up for question, is the body class. So generally for medium and heavy duty vehicle, well, mainly for heavy duty vehicles, they're manufactured in multiple stages, where a chassis manufacturer such as Ford installs a powertrain that they produce or another manufacturer produces, and then sends it off to a body manufacturer to upfit the body onto the vehicle. So some bodies, such as those with power takeoff, like a bucket or a refuse truck, will have some unique engineering needs, because a typical power takeoff system won't work for a battery electric vehicle. So we are anticipating that the costs might be higher for vehicles with power takeoff. So we do think that we might want to model that, but we don't see a need to do this for vehicles without power takeoff, such as a box truck or a tractor. Okay, so this is all the information we have. This is what we're discussing right now for the vehicle costs, and I guess we can just stop here for any feedback on this topic broadly, or whether there's any better assumptions we should be using, or newer sources, or just general thoughts on the methodology. I don't see any hands raised, and okay, I actually see a couple hands raised. So Christian, Corby, I've unmuted your mic. If you could unmute yourself and then give your name and introduction, organization.
Hi, Paul. It's actually Eileen Tudd at California Electric Transportation Coalition. Christian and I are splitting duties, so I'll be on in the morning and he'll be on in the afternoon. I was just wondering if the slides are up. I'm sorry, I missed the first few minutes because I had logged onto the wrong meeting. So if the slides will be available, or if they're available online.
Yes, the slides are available online, and also a discussion document that has a little bit more detail on what we're discussing on the slides. Both of those are online, so I think someone should be able to post a link in chat if you haven't done so already.
Yeah, please,
Eileen,
because I don't see them.
Eileen, this is Craig. If you look in the chat box, we did provide a link to the website where the documents can be found, but simply going to.
Craig, it says, I think that was actually only sent to the organizers. I'm not sure if the general attendees have seen that yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll make sure it gets.
I'll look for it
Okay,
in the chat box.
To everyone. Yeah. Well, and then just broadly, the materials are available where the meeting announcement is, or on the Advanced Clean Fleet webpage on the meetings and events. And we will traditionally put meeting materials with the meeting on that particular page going forward.
Okay, so I'm on that page and I don't see it up there, but I will go to the link.
And okay, and maybe you're on the, and just to, I guess this might be a good point to discuss. So we have the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, which was a manufacturer sales requirement, and we have a separate page for the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. So it's possible that you're on the Advanced Clean Trucks one.
You are absolutely right, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, and in hindsight, we should have put a link there to just say, hey, because they are related, obviously, and the terms are similar. We do recognize that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, just quickly, we have a question from Nakash Palathimvid from Cummins. On slide 13, do you know why there's an inflection point for fuel cell in 2024? So this is based a little bit on the assumptions. Actually,
back one slide, Paul.
Oh yeah, one more slide. Okay. So I think this depends a little bit on the assumptions. So I believe what we ended up doing is that prices before 2024 are modeled based on a slightly different Ricardo report that was based mainly on demonstrations. In 2024, that's based on the strategic analysis report based on low-scale commercial production, and the cost continues to decline at higher production. So I think is the 2020 price is based on more of the demonstration phase, and 2024 is more based on the production phase. So between 2024 and 2030, the rate that cost declines decreases as it's going from lower scale production to higher scale production, which is not going to have as significant a cost decline as from demonstration to commercial.
And again, we invite any other sources of information or new analysis to update any of these costs that we're discussing today.
Okay, so we have a question from Allison Torres. Are vehicle costs based on nationwide averages? We've noticed that costs are higher in our region, and this is from Eastern Municipal Water District. So the costs that we have here are, I guess it's not on the slides, but in the paper, are based on the nationwide costs from truckpaper.com and commercial truck trade, as well as the manufacturer websites. So those are nationwide costs, are not specific to California market. I guess if we do need to reflect a higher cost for California, that might be appropriate, but I think we need more information on what we should be doing there. Okay, I'll go back to the hands raised. So Ray Pingle, I have unmuted your microphone. If you could unmute yourself and give your introduction. And after that, we have Jimmy O'Day. So Ray, it says you still have yourself muted. If you could unmute yourself. Okay, there you go.
There I am. Hi, this is Ray Pingle, Sierra Club, California. I wanted to talk about your battery cost assumptions.
Sure.
And of course, the BNEF is kind of the gold standard. I heard an analyst at a CEC workshop a few months ago say that where they get their data is they actually have non-disclosure agreements signed with 90 of the top battery manufacturers in the world, and where they get their data, both current actual data as well as forecast data. They also have NDAs with many vehicle OEMs, and so they're kind of the gold standard. Most studies of truck costs and so on and car costs reference their study. The ICCT study that you have here was published in 2017, and it got its data from two other studies that were actually published in 2016, so probably using 2015 and older data. So that's getting to be 5 and 6 years old, and because battery costs overall have dropped 50%, in the neighborhood of 50% since then, I don't think that ICCT study is valid or appropriate to use at this point in time. As far as the 5-year delay concept that started actually with ICT, that is no longer appropriate in any way. I mean, to use a price from 5 years ago when the trend of cost reduction is so dramatic just doesn't work anymore. So the real issue is, what are battery cells and packs going to cost for trucks versus cars? And typically the cells are about 70% of the total cost. The packs are about 30%. And today, the cells, whether they're cylinders or pouches, are essentially commodities between trucks and cars. And many of the truck vehicles that we're seeing are coming out with the same batteries from the same battery makers that are used for cars. So I think it's a very fair assumption to assume that the battery cell component of the cost is the same as cars, and then you could use something like BNEF just fine. On the packs, there may be an argument that packs for trucks may be somewhat more expensive than for cars, primarily because they're making fewer of them. They're not amortizing that cost over as many vehicles. However, having said that, many of the car makers and the truck makers are starting to use modular packs that do lower the cost. So you have, for example, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which they cited BNEF battery costs for some of their recent studies a year ago during the ACT rulemaking. They didn't make any distinction between the BNF battery costs for cars versus trucks. So I think it's probably not a very significant cost. So at any rate, we would recommend to toss out the ICCT study because it's too old and get rid of the 5-year delay and perhaps explore some other incremental costs for packs, maybe increase the cost by 10%, or you'd have to do a little more research on that, or maybe nothing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And we can definitely consider that there are other sources we could be using. And I did think that it does seem that on the cell level, the batteries will be similar, and the packs might be, because of lower volume, there might be some higher cost there. So I think there are a couple other sources we're aware of. Backpack is a tool that I believe DOE produces that's essentially modeling what the cost of batteries will be based on production. So we can try to take a look at that and some other sources, see if that works better.
Okay, thank you.
Well, this is Tony with ARB. So I can throw this out there as a general statement to see if anybody has thoughts on it. One question, one just as one piece of information is we've actually seen some manufacturers use the identical pack or a light duty pack in some of the medium duty trucks. So my basic comment or question for people to provide us feedback if they can is should we look at it somewhat differently for smaller, like medium duty vehicles, for example, as to what the battery cost might look like there versus a bigger truck like a Class 8 or a semi? Is there a difference, or should it be pretty much the same core assumptions throughout?
Yeah, and we're seeing Tesla use their same cells for their semi truck, for example. So it may be that there's so many examples, and you're citing medium duty, that's certainly the case, that you can just assume that the battery costs with the cells and the packs are essentially, and always be minor exceptions, but essentially the same as for cars, which is reflected in the BNEF study.
Yeah. Well, and to the extent that you mentioned volume, we're hearing, pre-orders of a lot of pickups in the potentially medium duty or some in the light duty that should be relatively high volume compared to, a Class 6 or 7 type truck that's generally going to be much lower volume when compared to the light duty market, if you will, or the smaller vehicle market.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, just since we're on this topic, I'll just answer a quick question from Glenn Cho, who I believe from Toyota Motor Corporation. Out of curiosity, what is the logic for the 5-year delay battery cost of heavy duty versus light duty? So I believe at the time, there wasn't as much information what heavy duty battery costs might look like. So I think it was a question of basically, it's smaller scale production, it might be unique engineering for the heavy duty batteries. So one way to model this is by showing that it's essentially going through the same challenges as light duty, but with a delay. And I think some of the other logic was that typically the advances that happen in heavy duty are kind of lagging behind those that happen in light duty. So the batteries would just be another example of when this comes up.
This is Tony again. Just to expand a little bit. Yeah, so the ICT that Ray referred to is the Innovative Clean Transit Regulation. So that analysis and assumption was used associated with transit buses in California. So there's roughly 12,000 transit buses in California. So the sales are on the order of a little over 500 a year total, the 500 to 700. So those assumptions were to reflect a fairly small volume of sales in the transit bus category in particular. And it was a number of years ago, and there was very little information. There's a whole paper on what information was available about battery prices, and there wasn't very much associated with heavier vehicles that we could use. So I think the paper was done in 2016, and so it was predominantly looking at studies back to 2013 and 15 and so on. Okay. So a lot's changed since then.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take questions verbally from Jimmy O'Day and Arthur Yip, and then I'll go back to the questions in chat. So Jimmy, I've unmuted your mic. You can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Great. Good morning. Thanks for all the details so far, and appreciate CARB's granularity with studies to date. the battery discussion, I guess, is one point. Really agree with comments that Ray Pingle made. And I think what staff are saying is, time to update these assumptions. The 5-year delay at the time, made some sense for transit buses, but for all the reasons that folks have stated, does not seem to be the case with the volumes and the overlap between light and heavy duty or medium duty that we're seeing. And so I guess updating for sure with the most recent numbers, and also I think allowing for some granularity in the battery costs used for the different types of vehicles and the different volumes, I think would be a good direction. Just running down the list of items that CARB outlined in previous slides, agree with including costs from low NOx and GHG phase 2 regulations, insurance differences for different types of vehicles. On the weight and payload, I guess this is an area where I think granularity would be the right way to go, with just not assuming every truck is operating today fully loaded, and thereby assuming you're going to need more trucks for the same load if you're replacing them with electric. I think that there's a ton of differences across fleets, even within the same vocation, and there are different ways that they operate. So perhaps presenting data as a spread for these types of situations where there is so much variation, and not just coming to one number. On the question of used and new vehicles, I think it only makes sense for CARB to look at the cost of used vehicles in segments that will be regulated where people are purchasing used vehicles. And in particular, if CARB is primarily regulating large fleets, which has been what's stated to date, what types of vehicles those fleets are purchasing. I don't really see UPS and FedEx purchasing used vehicles, for example. So it wouldn't make sense to include that for if they are the regulated parties. Makes sense to have similar body costs for electric and diesel, with the exceptions of the power takeoff unit, perhaps. And actually, that's it. That's my list. Thanks for all these details so far.
Okay, so Jimmy, this is Tony. I just want to make a comment. So again, so broadly, the strategy is to have the initial focus on a number of the larger entities and as point of regulation, but we're looking to transition all trucks to zero emissions. And in the drayage category in particular, we are looking to electrify every truck over, by the 2035 timeframe. So the smaller fleet questions are part of it. We're also looking at strategies where, some of the concepts we did discuss were, for example, green contracting, where a smaller business might find it to be in their interest to electrify to be able to serve those entities potentially. And then more broadly, the thing to not forget, because we even do it ourselves, is that our time frame is through 2045. I mean, we're looking at it that way to provide certainty for everyone to know what to expect over the next 20 years. And so I do believe that we will be looking at examples of fleets that might be purchasing used normally and what that would mean. But when we're talking 2035 or so, we're also going to be, I think, potentially modeling used sales of zero emission trucks in that time frame as well. And creating a secondary market for zero emissions, I think, is part of the overall strategy too. So we want to be in a position to evaluate it, regardless of where we end up with the final recommendation.
Totally agree with all that. Thank you.
And I can just add one thing on the weight and payload. I think we agree that we do want to take a more granular approach. Some vehicles will be heavier, but not all vehicles operate at their weight limit. And for the Class 8 vehicles, it does depend on how long a range vehicle you have. And for the lighter vehicles, it does appear that there is the option to potentially just purchase a vehicle with a higher class or higher GVWR that has the same effective payload or towing capacity. So that's something we want to take a look at, definitely.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is Tony. I'm going to take the opportunity now. So Paul did touch on that the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation also has this reporting requirement for fleets to provide us information. That time frame is for April 1st is the deadline. And so at that point, we would have more granular information on different kinds of entities as well. So we're definitely going to use that, but we're very interested in looking at any other sources that might address payload or other issues that relate to trucks. And again, keep in mind, we tend to gravitate to assuming we're talking about semis, but we're talking about everything from a pickup van, class 4 truck through semis and so on.
Okay, so I'll go and take a couple questions in the chat now, then we'll hop back to the live question. So we have a question from Nico Bucom, who's, I believe, with the California Fuel Cell Partnership, who's asking, what is the level of accuracy for the cost quotes of electric truck manufacturers? Has this been verified with independent parties and based on longer term experience data? Did someone just answer the, sorry, the question just disappeared for me. Yeah, I think I'm using the show answered questions and someone marked it as answered. Okay, so I'll just generally say that we're not relying on, for the diesel and gasoline vehicles, we're mainly relying on the vehicles. The prices are available as those have been kind of verified, more shown. For the electric vehicles, we're not relying on the quotes from manufacturers, and as we're saying, it doesn't really reflect what we're planning to see in the future, and there's it's not really verified what those prices are. So we're really relying on the component cost analysis to show what we think an appropriate price is and show what that cost will be over time. So yeah, we're not relying on the quotes. We're mainly relying on basically what the cost should be after adding all the components together. Okay, next question from Phil Gibbons. Have you spoken to the manufacturers on battery costs? What are they paying for them, and what are the projections for the next decade? We did speak to the manufacturers a good amount on the Advanced Clean Truck rule, and this is kind of anecdotal, but it did seem to depend a lot on who we're talking to. Some manufacturers, especially those with experience in light duty, seem to indicate they could get close to light duty prices. Some which were smaller or not as exposed to light duty seemed to be quoting higher prices. So it did depend a lot, and most people agree that they will be coming down over time, but it did vary just a lot from manufacturer to manufacturer. Okay, next question from Eva Slover. In the ACT analysis, did it mention the comparison between truck depreciation costs, diesel, clean vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cell, and/or battery electric? So we did take an initial look at depreciation. That's it. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I guess I can answer this right now. So we did take an initial look at it, and we did look at depreciation for diesel vehicles. We don't really have any data to point out what this is going to be for other alternately fueled vehicles. That's something we want to solicit feedback on. So we are looking for that. For ACT, we did in the cost analysis look at model a higher depreciation for electric and fuel cell vehicles. We want to see if that's still an appropriate assumption or whether we should do that again.
Hey, Paul, I just want to make sure we're talking all the same language. So right now you're using the word depreciation, and I think in the staff report we use depreciation to mean just the price decrease over time, not tax depreciation, because that wasn't modeled, correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, and so that is one of the questions that we do have is when we're looking at a private business, should we be modeling the effects of the depreciation associated with taxes in the modeling or not? And we'll get to that on a different slide. So unfortunately, I think we were using the term depreciation just to mean the incremental cost differences going down over time.
Okay. We have a question in chat from Arthur Yip. I see you also have your hand raised, so I'll unmute you, Arthur. If you want to ask your question verbally, go ahead. You would need to unmute yourself.
Hi, sure. This is Arthur Yip from NREL. I just wanted to point out that NREL has an annual technology baseline that now has transportation in it, so that could be a good source of data and projections. And I also wanted to note that cell and pack costs, as discussed, they should be distinguished. And also same with prices and costs, because the difference is profit margin and retail price adjustment. And also that given the large credit requirements coming up, prices may reflect even losses that are made up by credit sales, as we know certain manufacturers sell their credits. So my final question would be whether CARB is projecting any credit prices and quantities. And I guess this cost, projecting the cost will go a long way into projecting how much a credit might cost.
Okay, thanks, Arthur. Those are definitely some good points. I guess starting with the last one first. What on ACT we did show I guess the diesel cost costing the diesel prices and the electric vehicle cost costing what we think an electric vehicle would cost. And we do recognize that some manufacturers might end up selling their electric vehicles below their actual cost, intending to make up the difference with credits. I think when we look at things at a statewide perspective, what ends up happening in that scenario is that essentially diesel vehicles will be sold below their cost, but the diesel vehicle prices will essentially be increased to offset the credit price. So I guess from the statewide perspective, there didn't end up being a difference because the cost would be recouped in one way or another. I'm not sure how, I guess we need to think about how to model that for the fleet rule.
Well, this is Tony, just to make sure. So, because you mentioned price and cost, I mean, I think the core of our analysis and our assumptions is to reflect what is the cost to the vehicle purchaser at the end of the day. And so when we say that, that's when, I guess when we say cost or even price, that's what we're referring to. So at this point, we're not necessarily separately trying to model what the impact is on the manufacturer, because that was already done as part of the prior analysis.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, if that's just made clear, that'd be great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but yeah. So I guess I understand the difference you're pointing out, but I think we might have used the term price and cost fairly interchangeably. But that's generally what we're meaning, is what ultimately is the cost to the truck purchaser at the end of the day, both fuel maintenance and everything else.
Okay. Thanks, Arthur. We also have I thought we had a hand raised from Greg Fritz. So it looks like you put your hand down actually. So.
Okay.
Okay. And okay.
Oh, Greg is back.
Okay. I've unmuted your mic, Greg. If you can go ahead and give your name or affiliation.
Yes. Hi. This is Greg Fritz with Actia Group. We make battery packs, and a little bit of concerned about the direction of this conversation. I want to give a little insight from a battery pack supplier perspective. You know, the cell cost is a function of the volume that battery pack supplier buys. And so most battery pack suppliers unless you're using an OEM pack like Motive or something like BMW or something, you are buying a much lower volume than automotive. So these projections, not everybody in the world is Tesla and can use the pricing of hundreds of or tens of millions of cells. And also, you know, they're not like skateboards that they have in cars. Most car pricing is based on a much different battery pack design going forward. And you know, the duty cycle of a heavy duty vehicle is much more demanding, much higher power, much more energy throughput, hours per day, because a factor of 10 more than an automobile. So that means, you know, the batteries experience a much higher heat generation and degradation over time, and replacement pack cost or the addition of better cooling and the cost of those things you can't ignore. And also when you're putting 4, 6, 8 battery packs together to get hundreds of kilowatt hours, you need junction boxes, you need for your cooling to have multiple ports, and just the durability, the testing that's required to validate the environmental conditions of such a more demanding duty cycle, and the lower volume of the packs. You have to spread that cost over a fewer volume over a longer time frame. And in some of the vehicles, like we looked at the refuse and the concrete, and it's very difficult to package large battery packs there. You can't just take a BMW battery pack and put 3 or 4 of them on a refuse truck. It doesn't fit. They're much smaller. And for hydrogen, you're dealing with primarily a high power solution, because the fuel cell has the energy. You need in most cases, a high power battery. It's a different chemistry. And in order to have the 8, 10, 12-year life that you want, you have to use a different chemistry. So all of those things should be considered when you make this assumption of using $200 a kilowatt hour from an automobile and putting it, just dropping it in a truck. We've done the studies. We supply battery packs to heavy duty vehicles, and it's not the same. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, this is Tony. You said you've done the studies. Is there anything published that we can point out or use?
Well, these are quotes in response to RFQs from OEMs. So not really, okay. But I do see your email and your link, and I can summarize and send it to you.
No, that'd be great. Yeah, and anything that you can share. I mean, I know that when there's public bids for transit buses or trucks or something else, that could be shared. If you're bidding to manufacturers, I suppose if any of that can be disclosed, then great. And if it can't, then
thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Would suffice.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And I see a question in chat from Jamie Levin. Your hand's also raised, so let's call on you. You can give your name and affiliation, and then go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Jamie Levin with the Center for Transportation and the Environment. I posted a question about payload, and then I know Jimmy asked about it as well. And I wanted to reflect on the payload issue in a couple of ways. It would seem to me that you should be evaluating the ton miles in a period of time. What happens in the current freight sector in the amount of freight that gets moved within, let's say, a 24-hour period or on a daily basis, and what the capability of zero-emission vehicles to move that same amount of freight, because it will have an impact both in terms of the number of vehicles to replace conventional, but it will also impact the throughput of a particular fleet operator to meet their financial or their business goals if they're restricted by what a zero-emission vehicle can move. So I think you had responded saying, well, you're looking for data sources. I think you need to evaluate the ton miles in each of the freight sectors that get moved over a period of time. And the second point I wanted to raise was on range. I do think you need to evaluate the impact on truck owners, fleet operators who may, this specific really to drayage, where one day they may have many of their trips may be very local, short haul trips, but they still need that truck to handle longer haul trips. It's part of their business duty cycle. So I think you have to evaluate that and what the impact would be if you have to have subfleets, and too many subfleets drive costs up. Thank you.
Okay, and I see.
This is Tony. Hey, Jamie,
go ahead.
Wait, before Jamie leaves, I see, because I'm looking at the way you phrased the question here. In the analysis that we use for fuel cell trucks, we did assume retail fueling for hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe we should model or expect that there will be significant hydrogen fueling in depot that's not publicly accessible? Or is it better to stay with the publicly available assumption?
Yeah, it's for long haul trucking, public availability is going to be very important. But for drayage operation, I could see centralized fueling by fleet operators. So there's some analogy to transit fleets where they're going in and out of a central location. And this kind of also relates to payload, that it's not just the total weight, but the ability to recharge the vehicle for second, and maybe in some cases three shifts or 3 duty cycles, where they've got to make deliveries, come back to the central location at the ports or a warehouse on regional haul applications, and they've got to recharge the vehicle to make the second trip or even a third trip.
Right. No, understood. And then I guess that's a good point broadly, that so one of the things we're trying to come up with the most representative or a representative outcome over the next 20 years as to how things will change. And so some of these what our assumptions will be and what our analysis will focus on will be what we think are likely outcomes. And part of this ultimately will be, what do we project the technology will be in 2030 and 2040 timeframe as well. And so all of that will shape part of answering those questions. So timing does matter quite a bit, because we do expect technology to continue to improve on the zero emission vehicles and infrastructure to ultimately be built out. And so we'll have to be careful, and we're interested in feedback on how to model a likely outcome, and still understand scenarios where this it's going to be the last part of the market that this can electrify, or have more challenges, that having a better understanding of what that is important for even doing the economic analysis and coming up with evaluations that are likely to occur.
I just one last comment to build on what I previously said. I really think the common denominator here is ton miles over a period of time, because this is why, if you look at, like, in the forklift sector for warehousing, you see full commercialization of, in the case of fuel cell forklifts, that's worked really well because you can get much higher throughput. There's a strong business case. That's why the Walmarts and Amazon and all these large warehouse operations have gravitated to that technology. And I think you've got to look at that with respect to freight movement as well. It affects the bottom line of the truck operators. It's the business case.
Yes. No, and then part of that was, so anybody who either who does already have fuel cell forklifts, is there an interest or likelihood of saying, hey, I'm going to fuel some trucks with hydrogen because I already have hydrogen on site, for example?
Yeah, that's an obvious multi applications at a central location where there's fuel supply. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Jamie. And we have one last question or hand raised from Kevin McGuy, and I think after that we'll move on to the next portion. So, Kevin, I've unmuted your mic. If you can unmute yourself and give your name and affiliation.
Hi, Kevin McGuy with SoCal Gas. Thanks for this workshop and thanks for posting the materials a day before. I think it gives people a chance to get a sneak peek, so I appreciate that. I heard a couple of comments or mentions that the larger fleets are going to be regulated first and they would be the first to buy, which to me would make sense. But I mean, we have a whole session in the afternoon dedicated to drayage and early action there, and they are not the large fleets. This is usually the second or third market. So these smaller fleets are going to be forced to buy the newest state-of-the-art technologies first, it seems like, at least in the Class 8 sector, which is contradictory to some of the comments that were made. Which, you know, you also have to think about the residual value when you're starting at this kind of third life of the truck, would be the third or second or third life of the truck typically. The residual value only has value if there's somebody to sell it down to. If you're already in that low range vocation, that you can't sell that piece of equipment up the food chain. You can only sell it down, and there's nobody really to sell it down to there. So that residual value, I would look a little deeper into. And additionally, I saw in an earlier slide that you're going to start with the cost per truck, which I think as a starting point is good, but only as a starting point. I think that you have to look at the cost per fleet and how the operations are impacted. As the previous speaker just mentioned, you know, we have downtime and range and payload constraints. I think that those are important things to look at as a fleet and not just on a one-to-one basis. USC Metrans, they just did a study on some of the overall cost and operational impacts of moving a drayage fleet to all battery electric. And I could send you a presentation, I could email it to you guys, but it showed that there would be a significant need for more trucks. It would not be a one-to-one replacement. So that drives up the overall cost. That I believe is almost a 50% more, a 50% larger fleet to do the same thing that a diesel drayage fleet is doing today because of those specific constraints. And so I'll stop there and comment more as we go.
Okay, well, this is Tony, and so I just want to say, I guess, a couple of things, I suppose. One, generally agree with what you broadly said, and yeah, what the key assumptions are and what's a representative analysis is all key to that, and including all those factors that you're talking about, weight and other things, time, and other factors like that. So, I mean, the focus of today, to a large degree, is to let's make sure we're using the right numbers. And then to an extent, yes, it's let's make sure we're covering the right assumptions. And if there's information on that, we would appreciate a copy of that study you mentioned so we can look at what it's assuming too. One of the things that ultimately will be part of shaping our analysis to a degree will be, as you mentioned, what are fleets doing today? And if they didn't change their practice in any way, shape, or form, what are the implications? But also the other question is, okay, what if they did change their operation to an extent that's still a viable business model? Does that potentially address or reduce some of those concerns? And so Jamie mentioned subfleets. Yes, I think we recognize that by definition, any transition to a different technology does require a subfleet to an extent. So that is kind of a given, I guess. But we will be largely looking at saying, look, we're going to model, and frankly, and we'll look at shaping the rule to say in applications and uses where there is the one-to-one replacement, those are the ones should be first. Over the years, as technology improves, that might continue to be a one-to-one replacement in the future, but maybe today it isn't. And then what are those implications and what does that mean? And then just on your point of, yes, the board and the governor clearly set a goal of transitioning the drayage fleet to zero emission by 2035. So that includes absolutely everyone. But more broadly, I want to make sure that it's understood that also when we've workshopped over the last several years, frankly, saying that we're going to look at fleet strategies, that we have been saying that the focus would initially start with the larger fleets, but when we say that, we're also saying that all of the trucks that are providing the service for that company, including owner operators they might use as subhaulers, would be part of the fleet and part of the strategy. So they are potentially affected, maybe not as directly in the early years as maybe in the later years. So I want to make sure that's also not missed. So we're not saying there isn't going to be any impact. That's just not where the focus is. And as kind of we touched on, is to an extent, if you get certain actors to act first, then those trucks might become available use that enables a secondary market that's also beneficial to the first purchaser of the vehicle, and might be a strategy that makes the most sense as a statewide transition. So, but yeah, so we appreciate those comments, and we do not intend to, I mean, we do intend to cover some of these other issues in terms of saying, is this appropriate assumption? Is this appropriate assumption given the analysis?
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I'll just read one last comment.
Yeah.
One comment from the chat, and then we'll go forward. So from Sean Edgar, Jamie Levin's thoughtful observations stand. There must be a business case for the refuse segment. The inability to operate a truck as weight limit will have an additional negative impact. So that's definitely something we'll look at, just weight limits for these different sectors. And thanks for the comment, Sean. Okay, I'll go on to the next portion now. Okay, so we covered the vehicle cost. Now just quickly going over residual values. So the residual value is essentially the value of the vehicle after it's been in operation for a few years. So we are able to look at this for the existing fleet, easily looking at online truck marketplaces, and we've shown some of the information we've gathered in the chart on the right. So as vehicles get older, their value diminishes, and this does vary a bit from vocation to vocation. So with zero-emission vehicles and also natural gas vehicles, there's not as much information available on how their value diminishes over time, and we are wondering what assumptions to make. In light duty, we are seeing that some zero-emission vehicles have depreciated quickly, but some are holding their value fairly well. And we also have the backdrop that we do have this goal to transition to a fully zero-emission fleet by 2045, and how that might affect residual values. So if there's any feedback on how we should be modeling this or things to include, we'd like to hear that. So something we're just interested in, want to hear feedback if any is available. Okay, I think I accidentally closed the questions pane, so I can't bring it up right now. So give me 1 second.
Okay, so while you're looking for that, I'll just read one. So I see a question is, are there any concession ideas being looked at with the actual driver's license, meaning the Class C DL is limited 26,000 GVWR, but requires the same skill set as a 33,000 GVWR straight truck application. That 7,000 payload delta could help offset the impacts to the EV. So broadly, I think, yes, we want to be cognizant of the license requirements, especially at the Class 6 versus 7, and what those implications may be. And so again, we're looking for there's a couple pieces to that. It's, what is the weight potential difference associated with the vehicle? Depending on the battery electric one, that's going to depend on range to an extent. And just to make sure we're all talking the same language, there are some battery electric vehicles in the medium duty space that are actually lighter, and even some of the buses, actually a couple of them, are actually lighter than the diesel counterpart, or about the same. But when you're talking longer distances, and that's a relatively short distance type vehicle, but if you're talking longer distances, generally over 100 miles, then you could expect the weight to be higher. And then there is a bill that does allow for a 2,000 pound exemption, I guess, from 80 to 82,000 pounds as well, to partially address that generally for alternative fueled vehicles, including the zero emission ones. So all of those will matter. And so as we touched on, one of the things that the comments we've received before that I think we're going to look at is, to the extent that there's a weight issue and you were buying a class 3 vehicle and then now have to buy a class 4 for a battery electric, that we would potentially model that being largely the same vehicle with a different configuration and potentially an incremental cost associated with that. And then the second one is, to the extent that the class 6 vehicle would then have to be heavier to then put it in class 7 and then no longer be able to be driven by the same driver, then we want to understand what those situations might be. And the better we understand it, then the better decisions we can make associated with it. Hopefully that covers the issue. I don't know if I missed it. But if I did, just send another chat, I suppose.
Okay. So I see a question in chat that's, I guess, related to the last segment that can still cover it. So this is from Eva Slover. What implications are there for the cost comparison on electric powertrain retrofitting on older diesel class 8 trucks versus ZEV replacement? So I don't think we've seen too many of these in the truck segment. I think generally what we've seen is that a retrofit tends to cost more than a new zero emission vehicle or have lower capabilities, mainly because there needs to be like unique engineering for every vehicle that's being retrofit, and also that because it's not designed from the ground up, adding the components in after it's been already manufactured tends to be more costly, and it's more difficult if the vehicle's not designed around being zero emission. That being said, if a fleet does decide to retrofit their truck to being zero emission instead of purchasing a new vehicle, I think that's something we'd probably be considering as being zero emission. That's, I guess, more of a question for the actual fleet requirement, but I don't think we're opposed to the concept of fleet designing to retrofit their trucks rather than buying new.
Yeah, so this is Tony. So I'll add to that a little. Is like, yeah, to the extent you have information you want to share with us, we would appreciate it. But as of we start thinking at this time, is we wouldn't necessarily model retrofit or conversions, if you will, as part of our strategy. But in the Innovative Clean Transit Regulation, the way it was structured fully provides the same credit for doing a conversion as it does as a new purchase. We would largely look to do the same strategy here. So we would encourage it, but might not necessarily model it because we don't foresee that being a high volume outcome or a very common outcome, I suppose.
Okay, we have a hand raised from Jamie Levin, so I've unmuted your mic. If you can unmute yourself, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. With respect to battery electric and fuel cell electric, you really have to model at what the performance is at end of life. Because if, in the case of the battery, if you have much less energy storage at the end of life, you're not going to be able to fulfill your duty cycle when the truck is new. So you really have to assess the durability of the batteries with respect to energy storage. And in the case of fuel cell, it's the power output. I mean, there's reduction in the power that the fuel cell can deliver, and what also the impact is on fuel economy. And again, it's at end of life, because if you're planning to use this vehicle for 6 to 8 years in a, let's say, a dredge operation, a truck better perform at the end of that 6 to 8 years as it did at the beginning. Well, it won't perform exactly at the beginning, but it better meet the the payload, well, the duty cycle requirements of the vehicle. So you really need to assess the durability and the performance of those two technologies.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to make sure it's not. Sorry, this is Tony. I want to make sure it's not missed. It's like when we're looking at the statewide analysis, we're generally looking at a, in this example, a zero-emission truck being purchased rather than, let's say, a diesel, and then that vehicle staying in the state until the end of its useful life. So that's one analysis. But and so then the residual value becomes really that 20-year life or 12, depending on what kind of vehicle you're modeling. And that difference isn't very big when you get that far out in time. One of the reasons we think it's important to have a decent cost curve is the example that you're using. If we're going to be looking at a fleet with a business model, or like your drayage example where they're only going to keep the vehicle 6 years and then replace it because they do higher miles or other things, then we also want to be able to say, okay, this is what it would look like for a fleet whose business model is to normally do that, and if they continue to do that, what it would look like. And so that's part of the reason this we want to have some information to kind of look at those different examples. Doesn't mean that we will, what our strategy will shape out to be, but we want to be able to evaluate what those implications are. Because, and as you know, there are some manufacturers who are specifically targeting higher use or longer haul markets, if you will. And so just being able to understand what that looks like, we think is also fairly important.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. And we have a hand raised from Ray Pingle. I've unmuted your mic, and I can give your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Ray Pingle from Sierra Club, California. Just a few thoughts on residual values. I think in general, battery electric trucks, setting aside battery costs for just a minute, should be worth substantially more than a diesel truck. And the reason for that is if you're buying a used battery electric truck, you've got a vehicle that automatically entitles you to much lower maintenance costs and much lower fuel costs and ability to realize LCSF revenues. So then to get to the battery issue, it'll depend on what is the state of charge of the battery at that point in time. And some of these batteries, will probably last for, as far as working, for 15 to 20 years, but it's a matter of what's the state of charge. So if that vehicle has adequate capacity and is suitable for certain applications, it'll do just fine. The other thing, and when we look at the transit industry, where we've got the most experience so far, you've got BYD that offers 12-year warranties on the batteries with a capacity guarantee, and Proterra has 12-year warranty. New Flyer has a base 6-year, but you can pay them a little more money and get a 12-year warranty on the battery. So we're starting to see that the more modern batteries are having pretty good lifetimes, and million-mile batteries are in the works, and we'll probably be having those in a few years. So I just wanted to throw those comments out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ray. And we have another hand raised from Jimmy O'Day. I have unmuted your mic. You can give your name and affiliation.
Hey, Jimmy O'Day, Union of Concerned Scientists. On the residual values, one aspect that is important for staff to consider is the residual value of diesel vehicles in the light of a decreasing market for those vehicles. If a transited all electric zero emission heavy duty is going to happen by 2045, the market for diesel vehicles is going to decrease, and that should be reflected in residual values.
Okay.
Okay. Well, this is Tony, and so so again, I'm just looking for feedback even after this meeting. Is to an extent, anybody who has a suggestion on how to do that. I mean, on the one hand, if we're talking a tractor, right now I would be assuming that, hey, if somebody's buying a zero emission truck and retiring a tractor at whatever age it is, and for any reason it wouldn't be purchased in California, we have the entire rest of the United States where it would have its residual value. If you're talking about a scenario where most of the United States was going to zero emission, then there'd be a smaller secondary market. So I'm kind of interested are you thinking that just from a California policy perspective, or are you looking at it if we assume that this was a broader strategy beyond California?
That's a really great point. Certainly our organization and many others, and trying to move policies at the federal level as well in other states, but certainly those are in place. So hard to model based on commitment or stuff right now. But Perhaps the residual values for diesel vehicles that are non-compliant with California policies today that are being sold out of state could be one place for data.
Okay. So we'll look at addressing that issue, because actually just now that I'm kind of mulling it over in my mind, I mean, right now it's like, well, clearly we're going to have some people start first, and then as the market expands, have more and more go in. And so that's part of, we're trying to figure out what the best rollout strategy is. What that implies is that somebody who might retire in a truck in 2030 still may have a purchaser in California that could still use that truck. And then clearly could use it outside would be one. So I guess we'll just pay attention to that, and I guess acknowledge how that might shape out. But keep in mind that largely we're talking about strategies that, as far as bringing in zero emission trucks, it's typically when somebody would be replacing their older truck, more or less. Because for most of the non-semi categories, you know, we're talking a minimum of 18 years before you're replacing a truck. So presumably that's pretty close to the end of its normal useful life anyway. So it wouldn't necessarily change the market in that regard. And so to an extent, we would just be modeling, if we're talking about some of these multi-step transactions from a primary buyer to a secondary buyer, that those will clearly already occur. To the extent they continue to occur, it wouldn't necessarily change the need for the market in a significant way, because there would be one less diesel vehicle sold in our assumption than would have been without the regulation, for example, to also then be available used. So we'll factor it in. I'm not 100% sure the best way to model that, but by and large, our strategies are fairly close to replacing the vehicle close to the end of their useful life.
Okay, so we have one more hand raised from Jack Symington. So Jack, I've unmuted your mic. If you can unmute yourself and give your name and affiliation.
Oh, hi. Jack Symington with the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. Thank you guys for hosting this. One item on residual value that I think should be considered is, you know, even at the end of a useful life, you know, 8 to 10 years down the line, if the truck is no longer able to meet the duty cycle, there is a high value in the metals in the battery for recycling purposes. You've seen a lot of movement there in the next couple of years, understanding that, you know, being able to adequately recycle these batteries is going to be necessary to meet some goals. And you have, you know, big investments from a lot of people, including, you know, the former Tesla folks, on that recycling. And so, you know, understanding kind of what exactly, you know, the value is of an 8-year-old battery and incorporating that into the residual value is going to be important to being accurate. I know that the Cal EPA currently has a quarterly meeting working group on lithium ion recycling. And so there could be, you know, good cross collaboration there to understand what that value is.
Okay, thanks, Jack. That's definitely something we can look into.
Okay, Paul. Let's move on to a few more slides, and then we'll take more questions after.
Okay, so the next slides, I guess we can just cover the next two topics at the same time and take questions from both. So taxes and financing, we are going to be looking at these in both to see what the cost is to the fleet and to assess the cost of the state and its finances. So we are including both sales tax that's applied to the sale of vehicles and the federal excise tax, which is an additional tax applied to Class 8 vehicles. We will be looking at registration fees and how they apply to both electric vehicles and the existing vehicles. We do plan to be modeling financing, and we do recognize that the terms will be different depending on what type of fleet is applying for financing. Generally, for the advanced lean truck rule, we modeled a 5-year loan with a 5% interest rate, assuming generally larger fleets. For smaller fleets, we do recognize that they generally would see higher interest rates and want to know what's an appropriate assumption for those. And we also aware that public fleets generally don't finance. We are aware that some do, but as a norm, they generally purchase outright. Lastly, we talked about residual values, and depreciation's a related topic. So companies who purchase vehicles and as their value decreases, they can claim the depreciation as a tax write-off. And because zero-emission vehicles are anticipated to cost more, this does potentially allow manufacturers to essentially offset a larger portion of the vehicle's capital costs. So we are wondering what's an appropriate way to model this, and one of the factors that plays in is what marginal tax rate to assume for these vehicles. So that's one topic that we're planning to add in this analysis, but we have some questions on how to include this. So going on to the next topic, which is maintenance costs. So vehicles do have maintenance costs to make sure that they're operating as they were designed. And we do have a good amount of data for diesel and gasoline powered vehicles. We've listed some sources in our previous Advanced Clean Trucks draft total cost of ownership paper, and we have the sources listed there as well as in the handout for today. We've also identified the data used in the Department of Energy Argonne National Lab A-Fleet tool that has a good number of additional maintenance cost sources. So in order to make sure we have a good sense of what these vehicles cost, we want to see what literature is out there and how to apply that to understand what the baseline is. We also want to see what the most appropriate assumption is for the maintenance cost of alternate technology vehicles. So based on most studies, ZEVs are anticipated to have a lower maintenance cost than combustion-powered vehicles. In the 2019 analysis, we assumed a 25% reduction for battery electric vehicles and the same price for hydrogen vehicles compared to the diesel or gasoline baseline. And we want to know whether these assumptions are still appropriate or whether there's more different assumptions we should be using or different sources that point to different conclusions. So anything along those lines. Okay, so we have a hand raised from Levi Tilleman. So I've unmuted your mic, and sorry if I mispronounced your last name. Can you give your name and affiliation? Unmute yourself and give your name and affiliation. Levi, it says you're unmuted, but we can't hear anything on our end right now. Okay, now it says you're muted again. So it says you're muted on your end. So if you could unmute yourself and
Try again.
yeah. Okay, we'll come back to you, Levi, and we have another hand raised from Ray Pingle, and after Ray, I'll go to some of the questions in chat. So Ray, I've unmuted you on our end. Go ahead.
Hi, Paul. Ray Pingle from Sierra Club, California. So on maintenance costs, you know, Consumer Reports just came out with a kind of a white paper on comparing total cost of ownership for electric cars versus gasoline cars. And in that report, it showed that maintenance costs for electric cars were about 50% of what they were for gas cars. So that's one new data source. And on the in your paper on this under battery electric maintenance, you've got several studies listed, and I empathize with. It's hard to get papers on maintenance costs, so I empathize with you on that. But having said that, the first three papers that you have listed, one is from Profi, the second one is from TAFE, and the third is from Electrification Coalition. All of those are at least were published in 2014 or further back in 2012. So I think those three sources should probably be eliminated. And then when you look at the more recent ones from Gladstein et al., showing a 50% maintenance cost reduction for battery electric trucks, and the UC Davis report also showing a 50% reduction in maintenance costs. It seems to me that based on this data, the Consumer Reports and these two reports, that a 50% maintenance cost reduction is probably appropriate. The one source saying talking with OEMs, they're seeing 80% reduction in maintenance costs. I don't know if that's based just on the drivetrain or the overall vehicle, but I'd love to believe that, but I don't think that's accurate. So anyway, that would be our recommendation, is to go with 50% at this point in time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Okay, we have another. Okay, I have a question from Jamie in chat, and I'm see he has his hand raised also. So I've unmuted you, Jamie. You can go ahead and.
Yeah, I question the differential between battery electric and fuel cell electric. Here you're showing it 25%. I just don't. What we're observing on the bus side is that it's not that much of a difference. Obviously, the fuel cell bus has the same components as a battery electric bus, but it has the hydrogen tanks, which are virtually very limited, very little maintenance on those. And on the fuel cell, the reliability has been quite extraordinary. It does require some extra maintenance. I don't believe it's a 25% difference. So I would ask that you really explore that, estimate with the fuel cell industry and with actual, our empirical evidence that we're generating with the latest designs of those vehicles.
Thanks, Jamie. And to give some background on the assumption we used in the 2019 analysis, that was based on some information from a study that Ballard presented that said that essentially a fuel cell bus is the same as a battery electric bus on maintenance, with the additional costs of, I think it was like 19 cents of maintenance per mile for the fuel cell stack. And because we were using the 25% reduction in that rule, that ended up being putting it back on the same level as a diesel or gasoline powered bus. Mm-hmm. So that was how that assumption kind of came around. Just based on what the study, it puts it to at the same level. But if there's more up-to-date literature on what the maintenance costs are for hydrogen buses and what they should be, we'd love to see that and just make sure we're using the most up-to-date information. Tony, anything to add or?
No. But I agree with that statement. Yes, and we'll even look at light duty to the extent that there's data on light duty. If there's not much data on heavier duty vehicles that are fuel cell electric.
Yeah, we're also going to be getting some data from some of the demonstrations and pilots we're currently funding and are underway. So we're going to be looking at that in some of the other states to see what the best information to use is.
Yeah, the technology's evolving very fast, and we're seeing considerable improvement in fuel economy on the fuel cell buses compared to the previous generation of fuel cell buses. And that's also reflected in the maintenance of that technology. So I just don't think there's a 25% gap there.
Okay. So
yeah,
we'll definitely... Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I was going to flip over another comment.
Okay, I was going to say we'll definitely go through the literature and look at all the latest information from the demos and pilots and just go back and see what the right answer, what looks to be the most correct answer right now.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Okay. Tony, go ahead.
No, I was just going to go ahead and just read the comment that Sean Edgar had submitted.
I think we can do that.
Yeah, so I'll just read it because it's a comment. So this is Sean Edgar says, the NREL study of Foothill Transit shows increased maintenance costs for battery electric versus CNG, and the CNG is more expensive than diesel. So once you review NREL and other sources, you will find a 50% reduction in maintenance for bus or refuse is pie in the sky. So that's his comment. So yeah, we'll look at the available information. And as Paul mentioned, we've also been collecting additional data from other demonstrations and trucks, for example. And of course, we'll look at, and then broadly that we know that a number of transit agencies and other actors in other parts of the US who have been running vehicles have also been collecting data. So we will definitely look at all the available information to shape our analysis.
Okay. We have a hand raised from Patrick Couch. I've unmuted your mic. If you can unmute yourself and give your name and affiliation.
Hi, Patrick Couch with Gladstein, Andros and Associates. I actually wanted to encourage you guys to move away from looking for a percent reduction number. Maintenance costs are generally a combination of scheduled and unscheduled maintenance. And the rate at which you have to conduct that scheduled maintenance is based on the use of the vehicle. The unscheduled maintenance are the things that you're going to learn from these studies. What was unexpected, what's failing now. There has to be some forecast out in the future about technologies getting better and therefore having less unscheduled maintenance. But when you try to boil it down to, a percent reduction for this application versus that application, we've seen claims from transit bus manufacturers of 65% maintenance cost reductions from an electric bus. But then we looked at the fleet's actual maintenance data, and only 35% of their maintenance costs were actually related to the propulsion systems. So it's very difficult to see how you square those claims up. So I would say my number one recommendation is take a step back from trying to get these high-level percentage numbers and start with looking at the scheduled maintenance, maintenance schedules for these different applications, apply your VMT or usage assumptions to those categories and start trying to calculate a cost on a cents per mile or cents per hour of operation, and then build up to a percent reduction if you need to do that. But don't just pull a percent reduction number from a single study or even a group of studies and try to use that, because I think it's going to, given the diversity of the vocations that this rule would impact, I think you'll end up pretty misled if you do that.
This is Tony. I just wanted to clarify a little bit of what you think the approach should be. So are you in essence saying for scheduled maintenance, determine the costs for oil changes, filter cleanings, spark plugs if you have them, air filter changes, those kinds of things, to come up with a number in cents per mile as kind of a bottom-up approach? And then what about unscheduled maintenance? What do you suggest on that?
That's where I think you need to look at the demonstration reports in a bit more detail and say, okay, what broke, right? And do we think those things will break in future versions of the technology, right? So there's a forecasting here about, will the reliability of these vehicles increase on the unscheduled maintenance side? The other thing that, these reports, the reports that exist, like the annual reports, are a great resource. If you have the opportunity to reach out to not just fleets, but some of the leasing companies, the lease service providers that are having to forecast these costs as part of their lease arrangements for their customers, that would also be another valuable data point.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any other hands raised or questions, so I'll move on to the next portion. So just broadly covering fuel costs. So the fuel cost is one of the largest components for these vehicles, so we do want to cover this in some detail. I'll give a little bit of background. On the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, we did base our analysis on the California Energy Commission, their assessment out to 2030. And beyond that, we used the EIA forecast for the Pacific region for beyond 2030. So in the meantime, both these agencies have updated their analysis. And now before they were relatively consistent, but now they're showing somewhat conflicting data, where CEC is forecasting that the price of fuels will decline in California over the upcoming decade, in part due to declining demand, while EIA is forecasting increasing prices throughout the whole period. So we are looking for feedback on what I guess we will be using CEC data for our own analysis out to 2030 as part of our general requirements. We are looking for how we should be modeling sources beyond then. And for electricity, what we have is that we have developed a battery electric charging calculator to help a fleet calculate their costs for about charging their vehicle in a variety of different situations and depending on what utility and what rate schedule they're using. So that's our existing calculator. We are planning to update that, and we just quickly want to see if there's any feedback on things we should changes or feedback to perform before we update this. So if you have any feedback, please send over to the ZevFleet email. So we are planning to update this and validate this against some other calculators that have been released. PG&E and a few others have released new calculators, and we'll just make sure our results are consistent. And after we calculate the results for fuel cost, electricity cost today, we plan to model how they change in the future using both the CEC and EIA projections. This is how we did it for the how we performed the analysis on the advanced clean truck rule, and we think it will be appropriate to do something similar for the advanced clean fleet rule. We would need to do some more scenarios with some different charging profiles. In advanced clean trucks, it was mainly based off of an overnight depot charge, and we could do some other scenarios for fast charging or other scenarios. That's something we're considering. And lastly, or I guess 2 more slides, on hydrogen, in the old ACT analysis, we used estimates from Trillium on what the cost of dispensing hydrogen will be at different volumes and with different types of fueling. We want to receive feedback if this is still an appropriate source to be using, or whether there's more up-to-date information or different sources we should be using. And lastly, we want to talk about retail fueling. We did not model any retail fueling in the advanced clean truck rule. We were assuming an overnight depot charge or on-site hydrogen dispensing. So we do want to know, we do see that in order to achieve the goals for the advanced clean fleet rule, there will need to be some level of publicly accessible either recharging or refueling. And we have some questions displayed here about how we should be modeling this and how much detail do we need to appropriately cover this. So these are some of the questions we have, and if we have any questions regarding fueling, any of the fuel cost assumptions or the assumptions here, we'd like to hear them. So I don't see any hands raised. Okay, we have a question from Christina Chen. Will CARB assess potential use of renewable fuels and their costs? So we'll discuss this a little bit later. California has a a low carbon fuel standard that encourages the use of low carbon fuels, such as electricity, biofuels, hydrogen, and so on. So we will be fully modeling that into our rule, and we will be making some assumptions on what the carbon intensity of these fuels will be in the future. So we'll be including those, and we will assess how to model the renewable content of these fuels. Okay, we have a couple hands raised, one from Jimmy O'Day, one from Jack Symington. So Jimmy, okay, you should be unmuted, and Jack will be after Jimmy. So go ahead, Jimmy.
Jimmy O'Day, Unit Concerned Scientist. Again, appreciate the detail CARB's putting into the fuel costs analysis. One point raised by colleague Patricio Portillo at NRDC that had to jump is whether considering and suggestion for the CARB to consider including VGI in electricity fuel costs. And there's a lot of work going on at CEC and CPUC to help monetize the benefits that VGI can provide. So suggestion for CARB to think about that.
Okay, we can include that. So there most likely wouldn't be a VGI requirement in the fleet rule, but as far as fleets voluntary adopted, we can probably, I guess, assess like how that would affect the cost for the fleet. There might be a cost benefit for some of them, so we can look into that.
Yeah, maybe it's like some.
Tony,
I was just going to say
a question there. So this was Tony. I just wanted to ask: is the analysis the CEC and others may be doing, is that looking at what the potential impact is on the statewide cost of electricity, or are they looking at here's how it could benefit an individual vehicle owner?
Well, yeah, CPUC is actually trying to put what value should be given to different grid services for VGI.
Okay.
And so, yeah, again, like not every fleet might use it, but it should be something that is reflected at least in the range, of cost. But yeah, it would be egregious to assume that every fleet would be doing that for sure.
Okay. So well, I think we'll make sure to address it as a topic, but I can say at least my inclination at this time, because I know it's a new area, is that we would acknowledge that it exists. It's an opportunity for people to save more money than we might be modeling. And we might not, I would say we might not model it directly other than a fleet example, as opposed to a statewide assumption of some kind.
Yeah,
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, if CPUC were willing to, help provide some preliminary numbers, yeah, I would. The more numbers that you could put to it, the better. But yeah, I do recognize that it is still in its early stages.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
A really big thing going forward. Like, if fleets could really take advantage of, depending on the fleet.
Right.
Thanks, Jimmy. And we have a question from Jack, and after that will be Tim Sassine and then Chris Shimoda. So Jack, go ahead with your name and affiliation.
Hi, all. Jack Symington with the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. I'm curious on the slide with the electricity costs for the different class of vehicles. I'm curious what the rationale is for the different classes of vehicles having different electricity costs. If in the future there could be a situation, even in the not so distant future, where different classes of vehicles are all charging at the same charger, and so they would be incurring the same rate, I would think. And so I'm just curious what the rationale for having these different costs are.
Yeah, I can cover that. So it's generally an effect of how the rate schedules work for vehicles. So rate schedules often have a fixed cost. So because larger vehicles end up needing more electricity, that fixed cost is spread over more vehicles, which lowers the overall component. And also because heavier vehicles require more electricity, they often end up being on higher power rate schedules, which generally are have lower cost than lower power rate schedules. So because the fixed cost being spread over more vehicles and the rate schedules are slightly more favored towards higher consumption, that ends up lowering the cost for heavier vehicles. Or that was based on the assumptions we used for the advanced lean truck rule, which is an overnight depot charge of 20 or so vehicles. So we will look at that again, but that's the general trend we see.
Yeah, this is Tony. I just want to expand on that. So, I mean, so both are correct. It's simply an artifact of the way we chose to model it. So, as Paul mentioned, we use 20 vehicles of the same kind at a location to determine its cost. When we're looking at a different fleet with a mixed type group of vehicles, then we would just simply represent that in the analysis. So it isn't that if there was a mix of vehicles together that they would all have different costs. It's just for simplification, we use the core of 20 vehicles of the exact same type at a location as here's what the costs are. And so when you model different energy use at different rates, you end up with different results.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And I see you address retail later too. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. So at the end of the day, it becomes you'd actually need to model each location differently, but for the most part, the differences are usually pretty small. If you're talking at least a dozen vehicles or more, the variation doesn't tend to be too big. It's the assumptions you use for the charging strategy.
Okay, next we have Tim Sassine. I've unmuted yourself. You can give your name and introduction.
Yeah, am I coming through?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, Tim Sassine. I'm the Market Development Manager for the U.S. for Ballard Power Systems. Thank you once again for a very constructive and collaborative work group session on this. I still believe you guys do great work and some of the best work in the world. And congratulations on your new commissioner, Commissioner Randolph. It appears that a peaceful transition of power is occurring without the need of the Supreme Court, so that's encouraging. And for resources, for hydrogen trajectories, I will direct you to one of your sister agencies, the CEC. In July, during one of the IPER meetings, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance presented some projections of hydrogen costs and cost declines as they come in the future over the next couple of decades, which should be useful for your work. They're showing things like by 2030, renewable hydrogen will actually start becoming cheaper than hydrogen derived from fossil resources. And that's interesting because there's going to be a call for renewable hydrogen from a multitude of sectors beyond transportation, probably in higher volumes, that's really going to accelerate the cost reduction of the fuel before even transportation has a chance to reduce the cost of that fuel. So from areas like industrial sectors and agricultural. So please check out that report. I can send a link, but I'm sure you guys are aware of it. I think it's a really good study, and I think Bloomberg New Energy Finance has been following this closely. Thank you.
Yeah, we'd really appreciate having that. We could dig through the CEC website, but it's kind of difficult for most of us. So if you could send that to the Zev Fleet email, we'd really appreciate that.
Will do.
Thanks. Okay, so after that, we have a question, hand raised from Chris Shimoda, and after that, Mark Sherpa. So Chris, I've unmuted your mic, and you can give your name and affiliation.
Hey, Paul, Chris Shimoda, California Trucking Association. Good morning. So had a question about how you are going to treat the low carbon fuel standard in the retail charging model. It's my understanding that you guys applied an assumption that the vehicle operator would take advantage of LCFS credits for the depot charging model in the ACT. But given that you're looking at retail charging, I was wondering if you could just share what staff is thinking, since the entity generating the credits and the vehicle operator will be two separate parties.
Okay, I guess as an initial thought, we don't have a firm position. That's something we do want to solicit feedback on. I think I guess two assumptions we could use are either that we could model that the station owner will receive the credit and then pass it on through to the fleet, and in that way the lower cost we pass through completely. And the other way to look at it is that the station owner might want to hold on to the LCF credits and use that to help expand their network or offset other costs. So I don't think we have a firm position on which one to use. Both of them make sense in their own ways. That's something we'd like to receive feedback on, but those two kind of make the most sense to me from my perspective right now.
Sure. And Paul, just one follow-up. So it's my understanding that light-duty retail stations also have idle charges where a vehicle is taking up a charger location but not charging. Just something to take into consideration. And then also, unless there's an existing model that demonstrates that there is a cost pass-through to the charging station customer, I wouldn't recommend doing that. I think it's reasonable to expect that the retail charging station will, at least take a majority of the benefits of the LCFS credits. But again, if there is, some light duty example of where that's occurring, I'd, be open to seeing that data.
Thanks, Chris. We can look into what's happening on light duty, and I'm not sure I've heard about the credits pass-through happening yet in light duty, but we can definitely, we'll see what's available there, since I don't think we've looked for that data yet, so that's something we can add to the list.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Well, this is Tony. Hey, Chris, before you go, in terms of other fuel types that take advantage of LCFS that is being used in heavy duty, we do see pass-through, not necessarily all of it per se. Do you think that's not a valid place to look as well?
Are we talking about like RNG?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the most obvious example.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect that a retail charging model, is going to rely upon non-fleet customers. For instance, the purchasing power and the negotiating power is going to be less for someone pulling up to a retail charging location. I would guess you're also talking about a lot of fast charge, not, opportunity charging or, charging, sort of planned overnight charging. This is going to be on an as needed basis. So I would not expect, some of the cost benefits to be passed through to the customers in that example where you're really going to need the charging in those scenarios. But, again, it's all kind of speculative at this point.
No, it is. And it's to a degree, I mean, obviously this is looking towards the future. I mean, but the future isn't necessarily that far away. We're aware of a number of projects that are looking to either have, I don't know if it's retail yet, but availability where there would be effectively a retail model being used for some demonstrations and some other things in the next several years. I guess we can try to look into how to address it. I don't have a clear approach at this point, but I'll tell you, I guess my bias would be to assume there would be a part of it would be passed through, and as you touched on, obviously throughput's going to matter in terms of the economics for any station owner, and if we're talking charging here in this case during peak periods too, then that will of course impact the electricity price too. So at the end of the day, it might not be inconsistent to include it. But yeah, that's something we do need to, I guess, we believe we need to address it somehow, and that benefit will go somewhere. So maybe it's just who gets the benefit.
Yeah, just one last thought on it, you know, as you guys are looking into this, you know, some other working groups on charging infrastructure that I've been on, you know, you should probably ask for some of this analysis, but, you know, apparently the business case for retail charging stations is pretty marginal at this point. And so I wouldn't expect, you know, for a possible revenue source through low carbon fuel standard for there to be, you know, definitely not 100% pass through. I think that the LCFS is being seen as, you know, something that may make the capital investment in the infrastructure a little bit more attractive. And so, you know, to the extent that that program is being justified as a rationale for building the station, I definitely would not model a cost pass through to the eventual customer, since you're going to have some sort of profit margin associated with the charging itself. And, you know, maybe someone's on from CPUC or one of the utilities that can address how some of that is regulated. But yeah, just something to keep in mind as you guys look at retail versus, you know, fleet-based depot charging.
Okay, yeah, so we'd appreciate getting the information as to which of those work groups those are, so that we can get right to the right people. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Mark Sharpa, and after that, Jamie Levin. So Mark, I've unmuted your mic on our end, so you can give your name and affiliation.
Yeah, Mark Serpa here. I'm with Synistics. We're a solar company based, and we do EV charging as well. So we have modeled the pass through of the LCF credits and everything to the retail. Tend to pass them straight through because it's compelling. But I want to look at your slide 22.
Sure.
If you could call that up, because in the commercial world, especially these large trucks, the cost of energy from sun-based systems or solar systems is about, when you amortize it out, running right now about 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And when you consider that you have 5 hours of sun a day at 2 cents, it really improves the payback model of the, you know, to recover the cost of that, the extra cost of the battery vehicle massively. Okay. And, you know, earlier you mentioned the concept of overnight depot charging, which has been, you know, a dream of of course, all of us, but especially utilities, because that's to their benefit. But the fact of the matter is that 5.5 hours of daylight sun at 2 cents is a very compelling cost improvement on the fuel costs over the life of the vehicles. So, and then when you factor in the LCFS credits, and we've modeled this very carefully, the cost per kilowatt hour is negative, over negative 30 cents, you know, because you're getting the cost of the electricity so cheap, and you're getting the credits, and with net metering, which is also benefits the utility, you can recover unutilized solar. Okay, so I think that we should include the benefit of a solar plan You know, and I've looked at, you know, all of the logistics companies moving in and out of the ports of LA, yes, just yesterday. They all, quite many of them also have these massive, massive bare roofs on their warehouse, okay? And that's, you know, once they factor all that in and calculate that into their fuel costs, it really improves their payback of these trucks.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We appreciate the information, and that's a good point. That like we do see that the wholesale prices for solar are a lot lower than what you would get by using a utility rate structure, and that's something. I guess that's something we can look at. We typically would assume that it would be a fleet. We don't. Let me just step back. In the room for the assumptions, we most likely would assume that fleets are following their existing business model, which for a lot of fleets is an overnight. They're parked overnight at their station, which is typical. I guess it is foreseeable that if they are transitioning to zero emission and the price difference for midday charging is so significant that it makes sense to do a midday stop instead of charging overnight, we could consider that would be changing their business model pretty significantly. So I'm not sure if we would be modeling that in terms of how fleets do their business, but you're right, that could be a substantial savings to these fleets who can fit that into the operation and decide that it will make sense for them. And we do cover LCFS. We do agree that with the credit prices as they are right now, it is a substantial mark off on the price per kilowatt hour. It does turn electricity essentially into you're getting money for every kilowatt hour you use, even with different assumptions for the LCFS credit price. It is still making it both renewable electricity and renewable hydrogen both very attractive fuel choices also. Okay. Tony, anything else to add on that one?
No, I think that one kind of fits in the same category as some of the other comments. I don't know that it'll be part of our core analysis, but it could be, hey, these are other opportunities that exist that can facilitate this market.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks for the comments. We'll definitely take them into consideration. So after that, we have Jamie Levin and Levi Tilleman. We'll try you again. So Jamie, I've unmuted your mic and you can give your name and affiliation. Okay, go ahead.
Paul, Jamie Levin with the Center for Transportation and the Environment. Slide 23, Tim Sassine touched on this. You need to look at more than Trillium and their estimates. You really need to, he mentioned Bloomberg as a source, DOE, hydrogen at scale. They're doing a considerable amount of research on large volumes of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen. And then I think you need to be surveying industry beyond Trillium. Some of these numbers, projections, there are a lot of caveats to this. And at the end of the day, it's what is the cost of the fuel, in the case of hydrogen, going into the vehicle, the molecule dispensed into the vehicle, so that you're covering not just delivered fuel or produced fuel, but dispensed fuel. There are various factors. Liquid delivery, you lose some of that fuel through venting that takes place in the transfer of the fuel. So this table is a bit, not to be too critical, but it's a bit overly simplistic. So that's one. And when you get into volumes of more than 5 to 6 tons or more a day, there are various logistical aspects of whether you would want to do on-site, whether that's justified unless you have there on-site an immediate feedstock. Some of the fleet operators simply don't have either the capital or the room to provide on-site production. So that's my comment on slide 23. And then slide 27, I'm wondering, these look like very good numbers that I have not seen evidence of, where you say class 7 and 8 tractors, 13 miles per kilogram. I'm wondering, and that's current, projected to be 20, up to 17. I'm wondering where that number or those numbers came from. They don't seem to reflect actuals. And lastly, this kind of goes back to the payload issue, but I think what matters to the fleet operator and the truck owners is what is my cost per ton mile? And the ton mile relates to different duty cycles of different freight types, but that cost per ton mile really is what my bottom line costs are going to be compared to my revenues. So those are my comments.
Okay. Thanks, Jamie. We'll also look at the DOE H2 at scale. That's the name of the program they're running.
Yeah.
Okay, we can look at that too. Regarding this table, I guess I probably should have run through this when I got to the fuel cost. So we also are looking at fuel efficiency. For the fuel cell vehicle specifically, we don't have too much data on their fuel efficiency. So in lieu of that, what we looked at was the LCFS program assigns a energy economy ratio of 1.9 to them, which means that the fuel economy of the fuel cell vehicles is essentially 1.9 times what it is for the diesel vehicles. And because we are seeing that we are anticipating diesel fuel economy improvements over time, we're also anticipating the other technologies will continue to improve over time as well. So that's generally where those came from. We would prefer to use in-use or actual data where possible. We're trying to do that for the battery electric vehicles, but that doesn't exist for all the different categories we have right now.
Well, I can tell you with respect to what we're seeing on the 40-foot fuel cell buses, well over 2 to 2.3, but I seriously doubt what this number on class 7-8 tractors, if you're carrying gross vehicle weight of 82,000 pounds. I haven't seen that. We have some empirical data, but I would love to see 13 miles per kilogram. That number doesn't exist as far as I know.
Okay. I think we'll look. Some of the information should be coming from the pilots we're operating shortly. So we can look into that to see like what the actual ratio is and what would be most appropriate for these heavy duty vehicles.
Yeah, and just to keep in mind, projecting out numbers in this area of fuel efficiency that are really off base have exponential impacts in doing the cost analysis for a fleet operator. So we really have to be very careful and obviously collect more empirical data. The pilots, continuing pilot funding and projects of that sort are so important to bringing some reality to what we model out. I mean, the modeling is good. You have to do that. But if the model has some wrong assumptions here, it really creates a completely unrealistic picture from the standpoint of affordability.
Okay, we'll take that.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And that's part of the point of having this workshop, and the information is ultimately where we need to make adjustments, let's make them, and then where things are good, and we'll keep using what we have. So do appreciate that.
Well, and I appreciate what you're doing here. It has to be done, but we've got to refine our model and our numbers, or else we adopt policies that are just not feasible, either from a technology standpoint or most importantly from a financial standpoint.
And understood. And I guess I'll repeat something that staff have heard me say many times, and I think others have said. All models are wrong, and some are more useful than others. We're trying to make this the most useful model possible to cover the core issues that we need to be able to address.
That's a good Brazilism. Appreciate it.
I heard it from somebody else. I just keep using it.
Okay.
I think it works.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to cover, while I'm speaking, I guess. So Nico Bokamp has a comment, is how do you consider fuel cost fluctuations for all zero emission trucks that are not bound by California's borders? And I think that kind of gets at one of the core issues is, yes, strategically, we're looking at the long haul market, if you will, or interstate. How do you electrify that? And I think part of that answer is ultimately you need a fueling network for it to realistically happen. So we do see that as the most challenging category, or one of the most challenging categories, I think, in here. And ultimately, what does it take for that to happen? And how it could happen is a big part of the question. And so what I'm trying to indicate is we wouldn't necessarily be modeling that our assumption is that there's going to be fueling infrastructure nationwide for trucks that come into California anytime soon. But we do see that an expanding market, especially retail, is going to be necessary to meet the overall goals. And by and large, the state is heading that direction. But and we do see some positive signs in the market of that potentially being developed, but that is a big area of uncertainty. So we wouldn't necessarily model it per se as a likely outcome unless we have additional information to do that and at minimum layout. I mean, what we're talking about today is we could potentially say, look, this is what the economics look like if the situation exists. And honestly, if the economics look favorable, which is what we are hearing from a number of individuals, and I think some of the reasons some manufacturers are targeting this market is if the economics are favorable, then the market is more likely to head there with or without a regulation per se. To a large degree, the regulation does provide more certainty, provides a clearer picture, and then to a large degree facilitates those investments because it reduces risk as to what the future would look like to an extent. So I guess that's a long way to say, yeah, we're not modeling it per se as a core assumption anytime soon, but for the long-term market, I think we would look at here's what the situation might look like and whether it's a likely outcome, in the next 15, 20 years.
Okay, so next we have a hand from Levi Tilleman, and after that, I think we move on to the next section. So Levi, I've unmuted your mic on our end. If you can give your name and affiliation.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. All right, great. Glad it's working. This is Levi Tilleman. I'm with Ample, and I have a question about batteries as a service. It seems like most of the discussion and analysis has been focused on pile charging and integrated batteries with respect to electric vehicles. But if you look at China, India, and then in the future here in the US as well, there are going to be increasing numbers of options for battery swapping. And that has pretty big systemic effects in that it allows you to divorce ownership of the battery and the vehicle. It also really changes the dynamics of how those charging systems interact with the grid. So I was wondering how you're thinking about that emerging set of technology factors.
I guess I can just start by right now we aren't thinking about it too much. We are seeing though that some transit agencies or some, I guess, transit bus manufacturers are offering lease a battery or rent the battery, or just different options relating to how they pay for the vehicle and how the battery is available. I don't think we're seeing too much in terms of for heavy duty vehicles battery swapping yet. I think we've heard some ideas, but I'm not aware of any plans by manufacturers yet. So I think if we could see some examples, that'll probably be helpful for us to begin looking at for the modeling side.
Yeah, in China, it definitely exists at significant scale. And I think it would be a newer thing here in the US.
Okay. we're going to look to see what's happening in China and other countries and try to see how we can try to apply that to this effort we're going under right now. Anything else to add, Tony, there? Or
No, I mean, just to be, I think you kind of indicated it. As of today, that would not be necessarily in our core assumption. I can see that would be, hey, this is a potential other thing that if the market grows, that could be a way to potentially improve the economics, downtime concerns, and have clearly some grid benefits. And frankly, that would lower your cost of electricity if you could charge batteries over a longer period of time and just swap them in 5 to 10 minutes or something like that. But as Paul mentioned, is unless that is a likely outcome, we wouldn't necessarily model it separately. So again, we're trying to find that best balance in terms of what we focus on and what's likely, and to a degree, maybe just discuss here's what's possible, but we're trying to model what's the common occurrences or more likely occurrences as a general matter of the approach.
Great, thanks for addressing that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, and we'll move on to the next portion now. So I'll cover the next two at the same time because they're not that long each individually. So first for the, fuel efficiency. So I mentioned this a little bit briefly. So in terms of what we're assuming for the gasoline and diesel vehicles, we're trying to use the existing information that already exists. So a lot of that's built into our emissions inventory MFAC, and we're using that along with some other sources on from in-use data. For both battery electric and fuel cell vehicles, there's less data about these vehicles. So we can use some in-use data from dyno tests and something similar. But where that doesn't exist, we plan to be using the energy economy ratios that the low carbon fuel standard program uses. So essentially based on the fuel type and the weight class of the vehicle, there's a ratio that applies to different vehicles that basically says how efficient they are relative to each other. And over time, we are assuming some efficiency increases for gasoline and diesel. For combustion power vehicles, this is essentially required by the Phase 2 greenhouse gas regulation. And for other vehicles, we assume that there'll still be some improvements as these technologies are relatively young and have time to mature and improve over time. And just to give a little bit more background, in the advanced clean truck rulemaking, we did an analysis to see what the efficiency of battery electric vehicles was. And we found that there's a relationship between how fast the vehicle's average duty cycle is and the efficiency of the vehicle. So at lower speed operations, electric vehicle operates more efficiently than its combustion counterpart. And we also see that many of the duty cycles shown on the left side occur at these lower speed operations. So in many of the applications we're talking about in terms of this rule, they do tend to be at the speed where it's the biggest improvement over diesel. So this slide, this message is showing what efficiencies we use in the 2019 Advanced Clean Trucks rulemaking. So we do have some additional information in the paper handout as well, but this is generally where we're starting from and would be looking for additional feedback on how to model this. Next, I can just go over the low carbon fuel standard. We can just cover them at this, have Q&A on both of them at the same time. So what the low carbon fuel standard is a regulation that applies to fuel providers in California that the carbon intensity of their fuels must decline over time. So fuel producers would have to comply by either selling lower carbon intensity fuels or by purchasing credits from those who do. So what this means for fleets using low carbon fuels or dispensing them, such as for chargers, is that they can earn credits by using these fuels and then offset them and then sell them to offset their fuel costs. So we're using the credit price assumptions in the 2019 LCFS amendments, which assumes a price of $200 until 2022, then dropping to about $100 after 2024. So what this means for an actual fleet is shown in these two graphs, the left about electricity and the right talking about hydrogen. So for electricity, the fuel cost, by the time the regulation starts, will be somewhere around 15 cents or 14 cents per kilowatt hour, and it would be higher if you can certify that you're using a zero carbon electricity source such as solar or wind. For hydrogen in the price per kilogram, it depends significantly on what type of feedstock you're using. So you can see here that depending on whether you're using fully renewable fuel or fuel with a higher carbon intensity, the price can be somewhere from $2 to no dollars in LCFS revenue. So we do see this program. Go ahead.
I just want to jump in just to make sure we're all talking the same language, because you indicated price, but there's both of these for electricity and for hydrogen is just the LCFS revenue, not the price of the to the vehicle owner.
That's correct. Yeah. So this would be basically the amount of LCFS revenue you receive from that program alone, and once you sell those credits, it can almost completely offset your fuel costs in these applications. So that's generally what we're assuming for, and just to give another example on how LCFS can work, in these applications we've listed, we are anticipating that electric vehicles would see a fuel savings of about 40 to 50% by themselves, but once you add in the low carbon fuel standard, it can almost completely offset your fuel cost. This does depend a little bit on the price of gasoline and the price of the LCF credits, but in general, it can offset most or almost all of the fuel costs for the LCFS program can offset most or all of the fuel costs for these vehicles. Okay, I think that ends. We can stop here for just questions and answers on this topic. Let's see. So it looks like we have a few questions in chat right now. Okay, this is an infrastructure comment. I can discuss this on the next section. Okay, I guess there's 2 infrastructure comments in chat. Okay, we'll get to those a little bit later. Next, we have a hand raised from Ray Pingle. Ray, unmute your mic. If you can go ahead and speak.
Hi, Ray Pingle, Sierra Club, California. If you could go to slide 29 for a moment.
Sure.
So I'm curious as to, this is a question of why the credit drops from $200 to $100 from 22 to 24.
So that's the assumption that the LCFS staff used in their most recent rulemaking. So I believe the general assumption is that more low carbon fuel sources are expected to come online near that point, which will, with more credits being available, the price per credit should decline. I think that's the general assumption, and we usually defer to the specific program staff on the assumptions for that rulemaking.
Okay. And I just wanted to mention that I heard a presentation from Andrew Papson from SCE within the last month. And they've got 4 transit agencies in their territory running battery electric buses. And the average cost, they did a little study on those 4 on energy costs for 2019. And it showed that the average cost of electricity within a very narrow range was 16 cents a kilowatt hour, which tracks closely with your assumptions. And on the LCSF revenue, those transit agencies received 30 cents a kilowatt hour for LCSF credits. So in that instance, the LCSF credits not only paid for all of the electricity costs for those buses in 2019, but they also pocketed quite a bit of money, probably in the neighborhood of, this is a back of the napkin estimate, $8,000 a year per bus. Most of those buses travel 40,000 miles. So, you know, there's a lot of variables in that, most importantly, the credit price. But here's a real life example of LCSF in very heavy duty electric vehicles doing very well financially with LCSF credits. And then one other comment on the LCSFS pass-through is, you know, it seems to me that really what you're after is what is the premium difference between refueling an electric truck at a retail location versus at a depot location. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. How much profit does the EVSP need to make, you know, and when did they put these in and what did they pay for them, as well as the pass-through. So I think it might be more productive to do a study of what's the, you know, cost per kilowatt hour of electricity through depot charging, which you already have, and what's a comparable cost on a retail basis. And one way you might get this is you might be able to do a survey, maybe with or without NDAs being signed, of some of the lead EVSPs like Electrify America and Green Lots and EVgo and ChargePoint and so on to get at that point. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And we can look in. Yeah, we can try speaking to some of the charging providers, especially those with light duty experience, and seeing, I guess, what they'd be willing to tell us in a potentially public email about what the charges, what some reasonable assumptions would be in that regard. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised. I'm not seeing any other questions in chat. So if anyone has any questions in the future, we can come back. But I guess we can move on to the next portion, which is on infrastructure.
Yeah, and Paul, just for time check, we've got about 30 minutes, so.
I think we only have 5 more slides, so I think we're good there.
Yeah, so we'll go through that, and I think we'll have sufficient time to talk about any topic.
Yeah. So infrastructure is another major cost element. Infrastructure to support both battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles. So for diesel and gasoline, we aren't assuming any infrastructure.
So Paul, you cut out for a good 30 seconds to a minute there.
Can you hear me now at all?
Now, yes. You want to start over?
Yeah, sure. So thanks. On infrastructure for both gasoline and diesel powered vehicles, we aren't assuming that, we aren't separately modeling them, as we're assuming that the cost will be recouped through dispensing the fuel. In the 2019 ACT analysis, we assume the same for hydrogen, and we can see if that's still an appropriate assumption. For battery electric, what we assumed previously is that the fleet would be paying for installing their own infrastructure, and we based costs on what was available from the utility programs at the time, and also information from buses in the Innovative Clean Transit rulemaking. So we're currently in the process of collecting more up-to-date information and reviewing studies and demonstration programs. So we're currently in the process of that. And just to illustrate, we have more information in the handouts. So if you want more information, that's the best place to look for the numbers we're using right now. But one thing we're seeing is a general relationship between the amount of chargers installed at the location and the cost needed to upgrade that site. It does, I guess broadly when speaking about infrastructure, there's 2 major components: the cost of the chargers themselves, which depends on how powerful the charger you need, and also the cost to upgrade the site to support to deliver the power to the chargers. So this is just meant to illustrate some early information on what we're seeing in terms of how much it'll cost to upgrade the site in a couple of different scenarios and based on the power level. So it's one source, and we're looking for more information, and we're also reviewing what we've seen from the demonstrations and pilot projects. Should we stop here or just go through all the slides and have open discussion? Because I guess we have a couple.
Yeah, let's go through, because we can go back to any slide, and then that way we don't run out of time per se. Everybody.
Yeah, okay. So another cost element that we did model in the advanced clean truck rule, we kind of touched on this previously, is midlife costs. So most vehicles do have some midlife costs, and we are planning to model those. For gasoline and diesel vehicles, this was based on the mileage, and we assumed an engine rebuild to be based on how big a portion the powertrain is as part of the overall vehicle. We are anticipating a longer useful life of these engines, in part due to the low NOx omnibus, which should delay these costs for a longer period. For battery electric vehicles, we assume that the useful life of a battery was about 300,000 miles. So based on the mileage accrual of these vehicles, that'll be when they turn over these vehicles. Replace the batteries. And for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, the fuel cell stacks need refurbishment occasionally based on a study by Ricardo, a consulting firm. They said that an appropriate assumption was refurbishment every 7 years, and the cost would be 1/3 of whatever the cost of the fuel cell is at that point in time. So these are assumptions we used in the 2019 analysis, and we would want to see if these are still appropriate for the fleet rule. Some other things we're looking at that we're just broadly seeking information on: insurance. How much does it cost to insure a heavy-duty vehicle, and what portion of that is specific to general liability, and what portion is specific to protecting the vehicle specifically. So we do see that zero emission vehicles will cost more, and it would cost more to replace the vehicle in the event of an accident or something similar. But that doesn't cover the entire insurance policy, just a portion of it. So more information there would be helpful. We discussed this a little bit earlier, so I don't have too much to add, but just how weight and payload affect the vehicle. How we should model how weight and payloads will impact these potentially heavier vehicles. California does have a law, AB 2061, that gives additional weight for alternate fuels. So we do see that, but we want to have more information. We then model diesel exhaust fluid consumption for diesel vehicles. We do plan to be doing that for this rulemaking. And we also are looking at just vehicles with power takeoff, PTO, and how to appropriately model that in this rulemaking. So those are some elements. We don't have too much to discuss them, but just we're interested broadly in information about these. So we mentioned this earlier, we are planning case studies on specific fleets to give an actual example of how this might affect an individual fleet. And we've laid out some examples here to kind of align with what the board has given us in the resolution in terms of applications we need to look at. But if there's any we've missed or some we should give more information on, we'd like to hear that. And just in terms of next steps, as we've kind of mentioned throughout today, we are broadly looking at feedback on all the cost assumptions, and we are looking for feedback. We're asking for it within about a month, so that'll be January 8th. We are having a drayage work group later today that starts at 1 p.m., so those interested in that should stay online or just come back in the afternoon. And we are anticipating more work groups later in the day. So that concludes the presentation. Now it's open Q&A for everything involved. Okay, I see Ray Pingle has his hand raised. After that, I'll just cover the questions in chat. So Ray, unmute your mic and please go ahead.
Hi, Paul. Ray Pingle, Sierra Club, California. And by the way, very much appreciate the opportunity to allow us to make these comments today. And I would also say that your efforts on this modeling program and assumptions is more granular, and I think it's going to be more up to date and evolving beyond the ACT. If you could go to slide 33.
Sure.
So on the useful life for battery electric, I think 300,000 miles probably was fair a couple years ago, but as I noted earlier with, for example, BYD and Proterra, they're providing 12-year battery warranties. And, the assumption we use for ICT for buses is 40,000 miles a year. So that's almost 500,000 miles. So I would recommend that you take another look at that. And the other thing is with all the tremendous amount of billions of dollars being spent in a very competitive environment to improve batteries, one of the factors they're looking at is lifetimes. And so I think lifetimes are definitely going to increase. And then on infrastructure costs, I just wanted to mention that in the paper that you provided, you talked about the costs of utilities having to upgrade their services up to the meter. And of course, with the passing of AB 841, the utilities now have to assume those costs for their side of the infrastructure upgrade. So that should lower that cost component. And because a good portion of the behind the meter cost is borne by the IOU programs, we shouldn't double count those costs in your analysis there. And also wanted to note that now many OEM lease companies, for example, PACCAR with Peterbilt and Kenworth, and also Volvo have already announced that they're going to make available as a financing leasing option to include not only the truck, but the out-of-pocket EVSE costs. So that's one way to lower the upfront capital requirements. And then finally, there's many vendors now starting to be created that offer electricity as a service, and that's another way of converting any EVSE capital costs into operating costs paid for over time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And we can we'll look at the useful life of the batteries again. That does seem to, it is something that it's going to come up, and we can definitely just see like what the appropriate assumption is, and also I guess end of life, what's the appropriate assumption for the value of the battery, as was brought up before.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at the battery life is start looking at warranties on some of the more recent vehicles coming out. That could help guide you, I think.
Okay, we can do that. Okay, I don't see any
Paul,
other hands. What was that?
Paul, you want to take Jamie's infrastructure comments in the chat now, since we're on the infrastructure slide?
Yeah, I can do that. Okay, Jamie Levin at CT, I can't comment because I'm on another call. CapEx cost and infrastructure requirements should definitely be considered. We recently installed a hydrogen fueling station on a 43 by 56 foot footprint with the ability to fuel between 65 and 80 buses in a 10 to 12 hour refueling window at a cost of $5 million, considerably less than the cost of charging infrastructure at approximately $77,000 per vehicle. Okay, that's good information. That does seem to line up with what we've kind of seen in some of the demonstrations, where about $5 million for a hydrogen fueling station of that capacity. That does line up, and that's a good source to have. So I guess that would indicate that it might make more sense to potentially model the hydrogen infrastructure separately where it makes sense, if we can get data like that. And Jamie has a follow-up comment that it's $77,000 per vehicle for the hydrogen refueling station, which is less than the cost of charging infrastructure.
I'm sorry, Paul, I believe, is that for the hydrogen fueling station we assumed before, or?
I think that's for his example of, we didn't assume the separate hydrogen refueling, we assumed they would be bundled with the fuel cost.
Okay, I thought that's 70. Okay, actually, I didn't want to misstate it. I was wondering if he was also saying it would be about 77,000 for a charging station.
I think our assumptions in the ACT rulemaking ended up being like 105,000 for the charger plus the infrastructure upgrade. So the 77,000 is below that.
Yeah. Okay. Bottom line, that station example was an on-site station at a bus depot, correct? And so it sounds like it would be worthwhile to, at minimum, look at a case study or at least a discussion of here's what it takes to put in a hydrogen station for a truck fleet that might want to use it, separate from the retail.
Okay. Next up, we have a couple comments from Sean Edgar. Sean says, for Ray, a real-life example is Omnitrans in San Bernardino filing an ICT report to CARB showing $50,000 to $100,000 per bus for infrastructure and $1 million a copy to replace their clean CNG bus fleet for marginal environmental benefit. Or better stated, I cannot find any GHG benefit for replacing an existing bus burning RNG with an inadequate electric bus, where the graphic on slide 32, oh wait, that's a different comment. Okay, just ending with electric bus.
So that's John's comments?
Yep.
Okay.
I guess I was in response to Ray, so I don't think we have anything to add to that.
Yeah. No, and so the part you were partially reading, there's Kevin McGay.
Kevin McGay.
It's only a partial fragment there. Do we know where the rest of that is? Is the cost on slide 32 the cost per charger? That's the question.
Yeah, so this is from the 2019 ICCT report. I hope that we link to it in the white paper, the cost source document the cost source document. If not, then I can just email it to you. And this is a cost per charger. So if for the one where we have 2 chargers, that'll be for the 50 kilowatt 2 chargers, it'll be about $40,000 per charger.
Yeah, and again, apologies before you go. So one of the things here, because we did receive comments in the prior analysis for the prior rulemaking, is like if you're going to have a 150 kilowatt hour That's kilowatt hour. But if you have a 150 kilowatt charger, then you might be able to charge 2 vehicles with it, even sometimes 3 in some examples. Or you might be doing 1. It all depends on what the fleet is doing. So the number of chargers will also vary a little bit depending on the fleet scenario or the fleet strategy. But I think what you see here is if you can use a bigger charger, for example, to charge multiple vehicles, the cost should be lower, not higher than having a single charger per vehicle, for example. So have a smaller charger to charge the same number of vehicles in the same period of time. So I guess I'll just, so what we did before is we in essence said, look, we're going to look at the cost assuming each vehicle has its own charger, knowing that in some cases economically it's probably advantageous to have 1 charger for 2 vehicles, a little bit bigger charger for 2 vehicles, and in some cases a charging unit that serves several vehicles. So by taking the 1 charger per vehicle assumption, we err on the side of being the highest cost assumption. And so if people think we should specifically model it separately, we can, but that's kind of where we're defaulting to, just being erring on the side of being more conservative and keeping the analysis more simple, essentially. Okay.
Okay, and okay, so we have a question from Nico Bucom. What are the assumptions with regards to capacity for truck chargers? These numbers could apply for some fleets, but for heavy duty, it appears to be very optimistic. For a large number of vehicles on the road needing fuel, the cost number assumption is a separate matter. For truck stops, the discussion within codes and standards community already goes beyond 2 megawatt chargers. I guess I'll start with the second part first. We do recognize that there is discussion about 2 megawatt chargers, but because they don't exist yet, it's hard to model. I guess it seems hard to model the cost for them right now. I guess that's something we can look at in the future, but the standard isn't established, so we don't have too much literature to point to. We can try to see what is available since there has been some discussions on it.
Yeah, and Paul, I'll propose for purposes of discussion that we will take 4 500 kilowatt chargers and add up those costs and say that's what we'll use as the assumption until there's more information on a 2 kilowatt charger if we need to do that as an example.
Yeah, I guess in the absence of any actual information, we just scale up what the current costs are for the existing
That'll bound it. Yeah, I mean, presumably a 2 megawatt charger would cost less than 4 times a 500, but that would still put it in context.
Okay. We have a question from Christian Corby that, if possible, I recommend changing the y-axis to cost per charger. That's what we should. Yeah, I think we should have done that, so we'll do that in the future. Are we assuming make-ready costs are borne by the utility? What we did on the advanced clean truck rule, I think what we will end up doing for the advanced clean fleet rule is assuming that the cost will be borne by the fleet. We are aware that the utilities have programs where they would end up paying for the infrastructure installation and they may offer a rebate for their charger. But I guess from the statewide cost perspective, that's shifting the cost from the fleet onto the utilities. There's no net change in terms of how much is being paid. I guess from the fleet example, it is a rebate and grant. It is essentially a grant or rebate for them, so it does give them a benefit. But because it's kind of out of our hands, it's in the utility hands, I don't think we'd be separately modeling that or including that in the model.
And just to add, Paul, part of the reason we're doing that is we expect that policy to continue, but what form it continues in and what portion gets paid isn't certain. So we will just reflect, here's all the costs, and then leave it to the reader to decide whether they want to presume that the program continues for the next 10, 15 years or not. So again, erring on the side of here's the total costs of electrification, assuming it goes to the fleet and borne by the fleet. And that's generally the approach we'll take. And I think as a discussion topic, again, we can cover if you act early, there are incentives. These programs are available now, and they may continue in a similar form. But if we're excluding that in making the decisions, then the opportunities are better than what we're assuming at our base analysis.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Jack Symington. So just comment, there can be massive variability in site upgrade costs depending on specific facility characteristics. Proximity to higher voltage distribution circuits is a driving factor. Civil works, such as trenching and conduit running, based on cost of location of stalls impacts costs as well. And I think we are seeing that there's a huge amount of variability in the demonstration programs on site-specific characteristics, like do you need any major substation upgrades or stuff like that. I guess in part, some of these are covered, as was mentioned earlier, because of AB 841, the utility will pay for everything that's beyond the meter, but even what remains, stuff between the meter and the charger, there's a lot of variability there, just how far is the panel from the location where the trucks are laid and so on. So I think we have a general sense of how much a typical site costs, but I'm not sure how we should be modeling that some sites are going to be more costly than other sites, since I guess we can say what the average is, but knowing what any particular site is just based on whatever the layout of that individual site.
So this gets to the issue of we need to model something that is representative at the end of the day. At the same time, this does weigh into what is the potential choices that a larger fleet has versus a smaller fleet. If you have 10 locations, you can start with a relatively easy location. If you have one location, that's the only location you can work from. That, I think, does matter, and something we'll recognize. We do have information on this from these other studies. I believe staff have summarized it. We just didn't put it in this particular paper.
I think
we're not
graph in the paper, but I'm not sure whether we're still in the process of updating that graph with all the different pilots and other studies, and it is going to change over time. But we are collecting the information.
Yeah, so I think we'll expand a little on what we did here today on saying, look, here are price per foot in terms of trenching costs. So if your trenching costs are a lot longer than our assumptions, that you can estimate what that looks like. But we have to ultimately pick some representative examples to do a statewide analysis. So we'll be looking at that again as part of informing the analysis. The analysis is going to be shaped by what is a likely outcome and not just what are outliers, for example.
Okay, next we have a question from Levi Tilleman. Do you factor in the end-of-life costs for battery disposal and recycling? These may be significant. So what we did on the advanced lean truck rule is that we see that for the end of life, it can be both a cost and potentially a revenue source, and that these batteries, even if they're not good for vehicle uses, is still useful for other applications such as stationary storage or salvaging them for raw materials. So at this point, we're not certain on which is more likely that fleets will have to pay to dispose them, or will be able to generate revenue by putting them into a different application. So we didn't explicitly model it for the advanced lean truck rule, and based on some of the conversation, we can look into what we should be doing for the fleet rule just to show what's most likely at the end of life of these batteries. Okay, we have a couple hands raised, one from Ray Pingle, the other from Jamie Levin. Ray, I've unmuted your mic. You can go ahead and give your comment.
Sure. Ray Pingle, Sierra Club, California. So, Tony, I think y'all are being a little too conservative by not including any consideration for the IOU infrastructure support programs. When you look at, the strength of those programs today, the fact that in the PUC's proceeding on the transportation electrification framework, they're looking at inviting the IOUs to potentially submit new applications to meet additional needs every 2 years, you look at the governor's executive order, you look at the all the work that's being done on the AB 2127 report, it seems to me that there's a clear intent on the state to really support these chargers. Now, as you mentioned, it pays for make-readies and in most cases half the cost of the charger. There still are other costs that are not covered by that. I don't think that these programs are paying for the smart charging infrastructure, some of those kind of things. So, but I would recommend that you look at, maybe talk to the IOUs to say, what portion of the total cost are we paying for with our programs, and what's the average out of pocket for the customer, and add that as an incentive that helps offset some of these costs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ray.
Okay, next we have Jamie Levin. Jamie, I've unmuted your mic. You can go ahead and give your comment.
Hey, thanks, Paul. I actually had to go to a Zoom call in the middle of this, so my question or the comment I raised about footprint, costs, and cited an example of a recent hydrogen station we built, that these factors need to be considered. And we actually continually advocate, as we move towards this zero emission future, there are a number of key factors that have to be assessed from both a logistics standpoint and a cost standpoint as it relates to operational efficiency. So we've been talking about cost of fuel, that's right at the top, but the footprint that's required to install charging or fueling infrastructure as it relates to fleets, that isn't always an obvious situation where there might be a lot of real estate in many fleet applications, certainly in transit, maybe not so much in the trucking industry, but even with trucking, where you have warehouses and they have limited space to site the placement of infrastructure. And then you have the issues of, we've talked, that's obviously the goal of renewable fuel, but resiliency is a big factor, especially here in California with seismic issues and now with wildfires and the impact of our utilities. Our ability to continue operation during those events, it needs to be seriously addressed. And then I touched on this in the discussions about payload and throughput, is the speed by which you can recharge or refuel vehicles in order to handle multiple shifts in the course of a day. So these are all important factors as you look at infrastructure that absolutely need to be addressed. And I think in my question to you, I noted that we recently installed a fueling station that could support up to between 65 and 80 buses, and this all depends on the average fuel consumption or fuel demand per day, but literally costing around $77,000 a vehicle for an infrastructure that would support that many buses. So these are sort of my concerns and comments as you factor in infrastructure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the comments, Jamie. We have another hand raised from Tim Sassine. I've unmuted your mic. If you can, he put his hand down, it looks like, so maybe not.
What about Patrick?
Is his hand raised? I don't see him.
On my screen, it appears to be.
Oh, actually, wait, it's on my end. Okay, I can see
Yeah.
Tim now.
I think it's raised.
Yeah,
Tim Sessing from Ballard Power Systems again. Just a note, and I certainly hate to comment or to contradict the comments of Ray Pingle, but I would look closely at programs like the Charge Ready program, because by their nature, they have to be cost neutral. Those incentive programs are paid for by ratepayer dollars, and that means that they go back into electricity costs, and those electricity costs should be borne by those who they benefit. So just look carefully at that if that's going to be considered. That's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. And that kind of gets back to we're looking at things from the statewide perspective. So those programs, they do benefit the fleet from the fleet's perspective, but from the statewide perspective is shifting costs from one entity to another entity. So that's kind of how we have to look at it from the regulations perspective. Okay, I see Patrick's hand now, so I'll go ahead and unmute you, Patrick, and give your name and affiliation. Wait. Okay, now go ahead.
Patrick Couch, Gladstein, Andrus and Associates. I just wanted to make a quick comment on payload. I don't think that was a specific consideration in the ACT TCO modeling, but you're raising it here. I just want to flag the fact that the incremental weight of the vehicle offsets the payload differently, depending on whether you're talking about a straight truck or a semi-tractor. On a straight truck, it's more or less one-to-one. You have to look at weight distributions on the axles, but more or less one-to-one. When you're talking about a semi-tractor and you're putting all that weight on the semi-tractor itself, it actually has a 2-to-1 impact on the payload reduction on the trailer. And that just has to do with the way the weights are distributed. So it's a nuance a lot of people don't think about, but definitely encourage you as you're considering the payload impacts for these different categories to look at the bridge weight limits, to draw a couple of static force diagrams and figure out, if I put more weight here, what does that mean? And it should become fairly clear for you. But roughly speaking, it's you add 5,000 pounds to the truck, that's a 10,000 pound reduction in the maximum cargo capacity.
Okay, hey Patrick, okay, thank you. I do understand what you're pointing out. But just again, for everybody's benefit, for the prior analysis, we were looking at not making a complete transition to zero emission necessarily. And so that would be so part of the core assumption was that fleets would make the purchases that would find it to be most economically advantageous versus those that wouldn't. But here we're trying to look at strategies to go full electrification, but we would continue to look at the basic modeling expectation is that the earlier adopters, when I say that in the next 10 years maybe, would likely be those that weight limit wouldn't necessarily present a problem. And then at some point, weight would have to be addressed or would be a significant impact on their ability to generate revenue, unless technology would likely be to improve where it became a non-issue. But so I do understand your comment, but I also want to make sure that we're kind of all of us are on the same page. As again, we're going to try to model what we think is the most likely outcomes, and I think potentially highlight in case studies or other things, here are situations that are less favorable or what the impact can be of that issue.
Yeah,
that makes sense?
Yeah, agreed 100%. The reality is that weight is not a fundamental issue for a lot of Class 8 tractors because we say they cube out before they weigh out, right? They hit volume before they weight. But at least for now, we're talking about potentially large enough incremental weights that, I think the DOT average tractor weight number is about 64,000 pounds. Potentially talking about large enough impacts in weight that, at least in the current technology landscape, we would start to eat into a portion of that group that isn't typically concerned with weight, but might now be. And so I understand everything you're saying there, and it's about trying to model what fraction of the particular vocation would be affected versus the ones that would not be affected.
No, and I do appreciate that comment, even though it might be obvious to you. It's probably something we would have missed if you didn't mention it. So thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more hands raised or any more comments in the chat, questions, and we're at 12. So I think this concludes the meeting. Unless Greg or
We'll
Tim.
just talk about the next meeting.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So this concludes the cost work group. So at 1 o'clock, we'll be starting the drayage work group. So this will be a separate effort by some of our staff. Well, it's part of the overall advanced clean fleet rulemaking, but a separate work group. So if you're interested, stick around for that. It'll be hosted on the same webinar. So if you're interested, log back in or just stay on this one. And that concludes the work group meeting. And thanks everyone. Everyone on the carb side, make sure to mute your mic before you get off for lunch. And I think we're good.
Yes. So we'll be back at 1 Pacific time.